rising and saying the Pledge of Allegiance.
That was on my mind.
So tonight, we're reversing the order of how we do things a little bit. Usually we have a presentation, discussion, and then do a consent agenda. But we have some very exciting appointments with our personnel. Do we have an update section? No, we're just going to jump right into it. So can I get a motion to approve our, is it a consent agenda still? It's not, oh, yeah, our consent agenda?
So moved.
Okay, a second?
Second.
Okay. Before that, do you want to deliver remarks before or after our votes?
Well, I would like to do it before.
Okay,
So,
let's do it.
exciting on a couple of different fronts tonight. That as the community knows that we had a vacancy at Dow's Lane in our assistant principal's search position. And we led a very ambitious and thorough search. And we found ourselves an amazing partner. Someone with tremendous experience, having worked in the region for a number of years as a staff developer. And not only a person that brings tremendous talent and experience to Irvington, but you look at the type of individual, someone that is charismatic, someone that is caring, a great communicator, and really has an amazing desire to be here. So I would like to introduce Dr. Andrea Cantor. Andrea, just give a little wave. And I would also like to say that her husband, Rob, has joined her tonight. So, Rob, welcome to the family as well. So it's with great enthusiasm that I recommend your appointment this evening. And then as another note to speak to on the agenda, that the item that follows this, item 2.3, is the appointment of a new secretary for my office, because Ms. Cordia, as everyone knows, retired from that part of her life. So we're in the process of appointing Donna Friedlander, who is another very talented, dedicated professional that's going to be a great asset to the school district. But with that said, we leave it in the board's hands. And certainly after the resolution, I'll welcome Angie to say hi after it's official. Point of clarity for Ms. Cardia. Should we move this as, we can move this as a block? Is there a specific resolution indicating? The consent, so we just moved it. Good. So you're on track.
Okay, we're on track. Are there any questions about any of the consent agenda items before I call for a vote? All right. May I ask all in favor?
Aye.
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 All right.
I am sending it to you.
Yes.
Yeah. Very good. Well, it's done.
Congratulations. So, Andrea, we do want to embarrass you for a moment. If you just want to say, if you want to say hello, say a few words. There's a microphone right in the back of the room. The formality.
That's the saying here in Irvington.
I'm so thrilled to be joining here in the school district and Dow's Lane to work with Deb and all of the other talented faculty and staff here and get to know the parents and the students. It's an incredible opportunity, and thank you. Thank you so much.
And so a note, while Andrea's start date is a month off, that she's actually going to be taking a couple days to come in and become oriented with some of the work, open house, superintendent's conference day, some PD with staff. So her transition begins.
Excellent. Well, we're very excited to have you. It was great to meet you, and clearly you bring joy and energy, so we look forward to that being part of the Dow's Lane community. Thank you. So we will next move past these consent agenda items and make sure I don't skip anything.
Paperwork's out of an order.
item number 3, so we'll go right into the presentation discussion. So just before we start, I do want to say I'm very excited for this presentation. One of the main takeaways I've had on the board over these past few years is one of our core strengths as a district is this administrative leadership team, which is really collaborative, and I admire the work that you're doing together, so I look forward to your presentation tonight. And one quick note is that we will go through the presentation. If we have small questions, just to move for some clarity, go ahead and ask, but I'm going to ask that we wait to ask the core of our questions till they're done presenting. And similarly, we hope to we will give the community an opportunity to pose questions after that. All right.
So good evening. Tonight, as Michael said, is kind of another step in a journey that we've been on here in Irvington. And on this journey, there's been a lot of critical work that's been led, work that really has set a foundation for excellence. And it's been reflected in a lot of things that we've done over the years. And to reference some of this is looking at the development and implementation of our district series of action. What's your belief statement about what we believe in, what we're committed to, and really what we value with the Irvington schools. We've had significant targeted efforts in and around instructional design and the development of our curriculum. That has been presented and discussed in this room on numerous occasions and in numerous ways, but it is the power of what our work has been. It is that deep level of what we need to do in a classroom to deepen the level of learning, to continue to enhance the level of instruction, and provide our students with the best learning experiences possible. But to support that, there's work that has to go on, of course, and there's been a lot of professional development that's occurred specific to that, but there's also been professional learning that's really been targeted and specific to certain departments, grade levels, schools, and so on. As a result of that, we've continued to see program growth. There's opportunities that have presented themselves along the way. You'll hear reference to it tonight, but when we think of things, we think of STEM. We think of new coursework that's been added at the high school. There's been growth that's come from this body of work. During the last couple of years, we've seen efforts to improve our communications and, of course, our facilities. When we look out there with homecoming weekend just around the corner, the first full year that we have a new track and field, if we look at the improvements to other aspects of our facilities, it's all come from this focus that we've had the past 5 years. And we don't do so without any kind of strategic thought. So the board and community should remember that in January, we introduced a strategic framework, a framework that we're going to continue to evaluate and that we're scheduled to provide an update on in December. So when we look at this framework, there were 6 overarching strategic goals that were guiding our work. And this is work that's come from the community. There was a cross-section of the community that worked with this and then made recommendations to administration and the board. And it's reflected in the 6 statements that you see before you. The first being a focus in and around the type of learning experiences we want our children to have in the classrooms. The second piece is how do we get there, right? The supporting of our teachers through professional development. But we want to have an environment that's innovative. We just don't want to think that we introduce a program and we move forward. We want to think about doing things differently. We want to think about expanding horizons. We want to encourage deep thinking in everything that we do in our classrooms. And so when we think about innovation, that's teachers, that's kids as well. So there's a broad scope that we look at here. We certainly want to have a culture where our kids are actively involved in our schools. And there's lots of examples of how that is going on and opportunities where that has grown through the past few years. We want to continue to strengthen our local connections. When we say so, not only the folks that are tuned in to what's happening, seen by the number of folks in the audience tonight, but people that have knowledge of our schools outside, people that are supportive of their public schools. And then, of course, underlying all this is that we need to make sure that we're fiscally healthy, that we have the funds, the resources, and the plans that are going to be able to help us deliver on the other 5 objectives. So in doing so, when we think about our goals, when we think about where we are, we have to make sure we're aligning things. We don't want to do things in isolation. When we're setting objectives from year to year, we keep all these things in mind. We think about those series of actions. We think about those strategic goals. We want to make sure that we have a well-articulated, aligned approach for how we teach kids, how kids learn through K-12. So there's a sequence of our thinking, there's a sequence of our programming that goes from one grade to the next all the way through our system. We want to see that defined and continue to be developed through our goals on an annual basis. When we say goals, we talk about higher level goals on the district piece, and we look at how those are then supported in schools, in actions that are being taken in schools, and then of course departments. And when we say departments, we think of athletics, we think of PPS, special education, and of course technology and innovation. And then part of the journey that we're on is looking for the evidence. How do we begin to define where we're successful? So with that said, the district, we're looking to have a series of overarching goals. And when we look at them, we kind of broke them into categories that connect with those other things that we referenced before. So in the area of curriculum instruction, there's 3 goals that stand out. The first 2 goals are goals that are ongoing and goals that will be focal points for some time. And we're looking at elevating student thinking and understanding, that idea of deep learning, looking at big picture, thinking about that global knowledge that kids need to have and teach them to be critical thinkers. We're thinking about the next piece is how do we know? Thinking about assessment, developing a balanced assessment that we're effectively measuring kids' growth and progress, but we're doing so in a variety of ways that's given us a lens into different ways kids learn and allowing them to demonstrate their knowledge and skills in different ways. A new goal for us this year is beginning to look at data and increase the use of data to be able to inform our work in schools, to be able to inform our planning. And then linking back to that 6th item on the strategic objectives, we're thinking about operations and finance. We need to take some time to evaluate our buildings and grounds. We need to think about long-range plans and improvements that may be necessary. Then looking at long-range financial planning. Well, if we're going to be starting to project long-range and come back to think that strategic plan update in December, well, if we're going to map out some objectives that are going to be big picture, longer term, well, how do we know we're going to be able to get there? What does the financial forecast look like for us in years to come? And then finally, communications, continuing to enhance our communications through the introduction of a new website and district identity, which is the district logo that you may have heard about along the way that we're actually in the process of rolling out at this time. And you can see decorating the top corner of the slide. So with that said, we're in a process and trying to find the right way to communicate our work in and around the board. And we have a deep process internally here in the district when we think about developing goals. We step back, we have retreats over the summer where we get into this work. We think about where we are, we evaluate what the next steps are, and we develop action plans. And the action plans play out as you can see here. We look at having an overarching goal. So in this case, and I provide a couple as examples, buildings and grounds. So we're looking at an outcome, recommend as to whether facility needs warrant a capital project. So do we have enough needs before we have to go out for a bond vote at some point in the future? And so when we think about, well, how do we deliver upon this? We have a series of activities and strategies that we develop. And then we look at the supporting evidence. Well, what is the outcomes of that? And in this case, you can see things being time-driven, linked to strategic objectives. But at the end of the day, we're looking at potentially recommendations for education. We're looking at community engagement, community process to see where we need to be with our facilities. Then coming back to the finance goal, not so different, but very simply looking at Ms. Stein and her staff digging in to district finances, beginning to perform different types of high-level analyses to look at where we are and where we project the district needs to be long range. So beginning to try to project 5 years out, 3 years out to see where we're going to be. And then communications, as I said, another front, a series of steps. And that idea of, well, what are the outcomes? What do we want to see? Well, we want folks, when they see that logo on the top corner of the screen, that they're going to think of the Irvington schools. They're going to begin to think about what the Irvington schools represent. So there's a brand, there's an identity associated with that. We think about a district website that we actually slow down process to develop and implement the new logo. But so we're going to develop our plans to be able to now roll And then looking at a process for increased community engagement. So what does that look like for us? Well, we're thinking about, and we've talked about in this room, community-based surveys to be able to get more feedback from the community on experiences and priorities to help inform our future planning and thinking. So with that said, we transition into the area of instruction, and I'll pass the baton to Dr. Kaur.
So, good evening, everyone. I am happy to talk a little bit about curriculum and instruction. It is my favorite topic. So we start always when we do these presentations with our three theories, with our three goals and our theories of action. And our first theory of action is really, in some ways, probably the one that feels most relevant to you as board members and as community members. It's really, what are our goals? What are we looking for our kids to be doing in our schools? And so when we look at that first theory, we're really talking about who our learners are going to be and how do we ensure that as a school district, we are preparing our students for this next life. And you know people, I hate to say 21st century because it feels like such a phrase at this point that nobody even knows what it means anymore. So I'm gonna try to avoid saying that, but it's really hard to encapsulate what we're all about. I think that as adults, we all know that we really don't know. We don't know what the jobs are going to be in 20 years, in 15 years, in 10 years. That's evident at this point. What we see, whether it be on TV or in the media or in articles that we're reading as what the colleges are looking for, what they're looking for are kids who are good thinkers. What they're looking for are kids who know how to collaborate. What they're looking for are kids who have good critical thinking skills. We do know that as adults. We see it. We've listened to, I know many of you have listened when some of the colleges come and they talk about what they're looking for. There isn't a formula. It's not your child does this, 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 and this. Okay, you're in. You're in. It's Yale. It's Harvard. It's Oneonta. There is no formula. So what we know is that we need to be creative. We need to be thinking about preparing kids. We need to be thinking about providing lots of different opportunities that capture the hearts, the souls, and the minds of your children. And that's the mission of our district. It's the mission of every high-achieving school district, and certainly the things I'm saying are no different than what you would be hearing in our neighboring districts, in Westchester. So it's hard sometimes to encapsulate exactly what the learning should be because it keeps changing. And what we want to make sure is we want to make sure our programs, our courses, our curriculum, our classrooms are all working toward a common goal. And so when you read our first theory of action, that's what we're looking for. We're looking to ensure that our environment is really supporting the growth and welfare of your children in a way that's going to get them ready. So if your child's in first grade, it may feel like they have a lot of years, but it goes and it goes fast, and we're busy trying to make sure that that program is readying your child for 4th grade and 5th grade and middle school and high school and beyond. So our first theory is really where we hang our hats. Our second theory says, basically, if our teachers aren't ready to provide these kinds of environments, then no matter how much we believe in our first theory of action, we will not be successful. Our third theory speaks to, there's an accountability component to it. For years and years, we had pockets of good instruction. It mattered if your child got into this 2nd grade and not the other 2nd grade. It felt like the curriculum was different. We're not there anymore. We haven't been there now for many, many years. And we've been successful in raising our standards around observation and evaluation, and knowing that as building administrators and district leaders, we have common expectations for what we see in our classrooms. These three theories are the foundation of the work that we have talked about year after year after year. And I would say that there was a time, and certainly in my past lives, not necessarily in Irvington, where teachers would say, oh, what are we going to do this year? What's the new initiative? Oh, what do you want us to do now? And they would feel that we were constantly, and not just us, the state, national level at times, that we kept coming up with some new idea. Well, let's try this. Maybe this would work. And one of the things that I am so proud of in our work together, with Dr. Harrison, myself, and our administrators, is that we've stayed the course. And we've said said, these are the priorities and this is how we're gonna get there. And when we set out to say, we did not have a strong enough STEM program, we didn't. We did not have strong enough programming options for kids. We set out on a path to say, well, how are we gonna change that? And we have changed that. And so when we say that we're trying to figure out what can we do, what do we hold at bay, that is a constant conversation and discussion amongst us, because we need to make sure that we are working within what we can do and what we can do well. So tonight I think you're gonna hear lots of really nice examples from our buildings of the work that we're doing, the work that our teachers are doing to prepare for their classrooms so that our students are receiving the high level of instruction and a focus on teaching thinking in a way that we think is gonna meet the expectation of all of you as our community, our board members, and of our teachers and all of us as educators. So sometimes when I'll say this amongst the teachers, they smirk or they'll laugh, and sometimes my fellow administrators too. We have coined the phrase and use it often, this whole idea of a well-developed brain. And we are clear that this is the goal. We want to make sure that when we're working in our classrooms, that we are working toward this common goal. Knowledge is important. Nobody could ever dispute that knowledge is important, but the reality is we are long beyond figuring out what knowledge our kids actually need in our schools. And the challenge of it is we're still teaching some of the same history that we were teaching 20 years ago, when we know that history is being made every single day. So we would be foolish to think that we could teach the kids all the knowledge that they need. We just can't. But we do know that knowledge is our vehicle for teaching. And so knowledge is important, and we need to use that knowledge in order to reach this goal of having a well-developed brain. We want our students thinking about their thinking. We want our students thinking and functioning with automaticity, and making sure that whether that be in math or in any other area, that those critical thinking skills allow them to handle situations, respond, not react, think, respond, and make good decisions and make good choices. So a well-developed brain is something that we talk about through two different lenses. One is the lens of the child and our goal around creating well-developed brains in our schools. The other is through the lens of our teachers. So when we work with our teachers through professional learning, if I'm a math teacher or a science teacher or an ELA teacher, chances are in elementary, well, I don't want to take that one back. I'll just stick with math, science, social studies for the moment. Chances are I went into that field because I was good at it. I loved it, I was passionate about it, maybe mom or dad was in that field or somehow connected to it, and somehow I loved it, but probably, most of all, I was good at it. We like to be good at things. And so our teachers very often have well-developed brains in the areas that they're teaching. So one of our goals as a district in teaching thinking is helping our teachers to slow down and step back. Their brains work with automaticity. There are things that need to be said to our students as learners that, yeah, as a social studies teacher, I already have that information. I have that background. I have a well-developed brain. So we use the term of well-developed brain for two things. One, to slow teachers down to make sure that they are engaging students and providing students with the knowledge, skills, and level of thinking that they need to be successful. Sometimes we think in our learning, especially as we get to the secondary level, if we give our students the knowledge and the skill, they're going to do that thinking automatically because we do it, because we have well-developed brains. But our students aren't there yet necessarily, or they're there in varying degrees. So when we talk about well-developed brains, we use that term to ensure that we're stepping back and we're making sure, are we thinking about how our students are thinking, and are we sure that we're developing a thinking curriculum? Last year, we moved our work of curriculum design to the next level when we launched and started to focus more deeply on the 4 learning goals. These are teachers' teaching goals: knowledge, skill, making meaning, and transfer. Everything that a teacher is doing in their classroom is at one point or another working toward that goal. And using these goals, and we call these stage 1 goals, and I'm going to explain that in a second. These are stage 1 goals, and this is when a teacher is designing their instruction. We want to make sure they're accounting for all 4 of these. So is it wonderful if your child comes to school and gets some good, deep Knowledge? Of course it is. Do we want them to practice skills? Should skills be repetitive and show up more than one time? Absolutely. But we need teachers to be designing instruction for making meaning. It's taking the knowledge and skill and putting it together and figuring out the so what. How does this make sense? And ultimately, the transfer. Because it's those transfer goals that lead us to a stronger infrastructure of thinking as a learner that allows me to take my learning from each year into the next. So this year, we have increased our focus on stage 2. I'm going to skip for a second. So this is our unit planner. When we launched our curriculum work 4 years ago, we were a district that we had pockets of great instruction. We have really good teachers. We are very fortunate in Irvington to have teachers who come in every day and are thinking and planning and trying to figure out how do we provide the best program for our students. But what we didn't have was a written curriculum. So we set out 4 years ago to get a written curriculum. Well, some places buy curriculum. They go and they find a company who's made this curriculum. They've written all the lessons, and the teachers come in and they read through the lessons and they read the next step, and that's how they teach. But we need to ensure that we have a deeper curriculum, that we have a thought-provoking curriculum, that our curriculum is aligned with what our goals are and what we hope for in our community. So we set out 4 years ago to get our curriculum written down. And we did that using a model called, a framework called Understanding by Design. And it's based in these three stages. The first is planning. How do we ensure that all of our teachers have a really good, solid plan for their instruction? Stage 2, how do we assess for it? How do we know, if these are our teaching goals, how do we know that students are learning what we would like them to learn, what we hope for them to learn, and going to the next level? And then stage 3, which are the learning activities. Those are the things that the teachers do and the students do every day in their classrooms, how they're grouped, the activities that they're doing. That's all the learning plan. That's all stage 3. That's the daily. It's the daily stuff. It's the stuff that you see. It's the things that come home with your child at the end of the day. So these 3 stages make up our framework for instructional design. Up until this past year, we were very heavily focused on stage 1. And that needed to be the starting point. This year, we're going from stage 1, which is the planning of instruction, to assessing for instruction. So teachers have started to deliver this curriculum using this new model, but we haven't necessarily had the focus on the stage 2 part because we were still developing and continue to develop stage 1. So with that,
Just the quick clarifying question. I don't know if it's been updated, but later on you're going to reference stage 1, 2, and 3 in the document, and this is what we're talking about.
yes.
Okay.
So this year, the administrators, as part of our administrative retreat, is we stepped back and said, well, if we're launching into stage 2, what does assessment mean? What do we think of when we talk about assessment? What are we looking for? And so when we think about assessment, and bear with me, I am going to just read this part, although I generally don't like to, and the sad part is I also have to put my glasses on. Irvington UFSD is working towards developing a balanced assessment system based on instructional goals that assess knowledge, skill, and thinking. That is standards and performance-based and measures learning through both qualitative and quantitative data. It is examined both horizontally and longitudinally based on common criteria and assessments. And just as a point of clarity, what that means is we're looking across our grade levels and across our courses, and we're also looking vertically. We're saying, if this is what we're doing in 2nd grade, what are we doing in 3rd, in 4th, in 5th, in 6th, and so on. Assessments will be varied in design, purpose, and differentiated to ensure expectations for metacognition, thinking about thinking, meaning-making, and transfer. That's the higher level work. So we engage in the knowledge and the skill, but our goals are always around the higher level work. Expectations for this system include accurate assessment of students' knowledge, skill, and thinking. That reflects a method for evaluation of efficacy of practice to meet our goals, including high levels of student engagement. So what you are seeing here tonight is really our launch. It's our launch of our goal around where do we see ourselves in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years? We would expect to have this assessment vision laid out, and you would begin, or you should be, all along the way, you will be seeing how we are putting this goal into action. But in order for us to do this, there are a lot of moving parts to make it happen. Tonight, as our building administrators and our department leaders speak about their work, what you are really hearing, and it's trusting a process to a certain degree, but what you're hearing, they're going to talk about the steps that we're taking this year to reach this goal, to ensure that our assessment system is exactly where we want it to be and really is working at the highest of levels. In order for us to do this, we know we need to get clarity around data. We need to ensure that as part of our program development, data is one component. So in that previous slide, where I referenced qualitative and quantitative. So we need to ensure that we're looking at multiple levels of data and that we're triangulating our data to ensure that our students are meeting those goals of our instructional design. So this year, in creating a foundation, the administration and faculty will have as a result, will have a deeper understanding of data to inform instruction and planning. So we're realistic in what we can accomplish in a given year. If we've given all of the time and energy to stage 1, then it is only fair and appropriate for us to do the same for stage 2. Did we stop teaching for these last 4 years? Well, I hope not. I hope that nobody feels that their child hasn't learned anything in 4 years. So what we do in education is we fly the plane while we're building it a little bit. So instruction continued. We refined it and refined it and will continue to refine it. Assessment is the same thing. We are assessing students. We've been assessing students for years. But now what we're looking to do is become more targeted. We're looking to get greater clarity. We're looking to say, if this is the teaching goal, how do we know? So this year we're launching a process. We've started to examine our existing data. We have certain data sets I know I've shared in the past on my the math example, because I think it's one of our most comprehensive approaches. 4 years ago, we launched the new math modules. Initially, we were just teaching the teaching of mathematics so that our classrooms were aligned with the new expectations of the New York State standards. At this point, we have regular assessments that we use, the data that we analyze, and it informs our thinking and our planning. That's the cycle. That's what it should be, that we develop our curriculum, we develop the instruction, we develop our assessments, we use that data, it informs where we need to go, what are we doing well, and what do we need to do differently. We're looking to identify new data, development of new instructional programs. So with every instructional program that we develop or an approach that we develop, we are looking for what data will surface as a result of that work that we're doing, and how can we use that data to inform our instruction. Part of doing this kind of work requires us to engage and elevate everybody. When I say everybody, our teachers, along with the administrators, myself, raise our level of thinking about data and using data. So this year we have a group of K-12 instructional leaders, and just for clarification, that's the department chairs, as well as K-8 team leaders or grade level chairs, might be another term you're familiar with. And so we have a group of about 25 or 28 people who sit in a room, our instructional coaches, all our administrators, myself, Chris. And this year our instructional leadership goal is all around data, and starting to surface individual data as well as building level data to start to say, so how does this data help us? How do we look at data that in a way that informs our thinking, but also to ensure that we're using the right data? Because there's a lot of information out there. We don't want to spin our wheels looking at data that's not going to actually help us. So it's not just naming it and saying, oh, here's some data we could use. It's about saying, is this good, valid data? And we have to, in order to ensure that we are using valid data, that requires that type of analysis, looking at those results and then understanding and linking it back to our instructional design. The third component of that slide is the plan for future data, looking at how do we standardize our approach and our practices so that we're examining data on a regular basis and as part of our regular work.
And Marina, may I ask ask a question? Just so I'm clear, because I'm looking at the presentation that was done last year and following what you just presented. Is the using data, vision, and articulation, is that what's new this year? Because we were told this was the next step in the process, but this is the first time that we're actually receiving this as articulated as such, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
And it is inherently linked to the assessment
Okay,
slide.
and likewise, I was going to say, I know that I recognize certain words and sentences within this statement and vision of assessment, but this also is more fully developed this time.
Exactly.
Okay.
So if I just take us back to the unit planner, so the unit planner is not just one piece, and that's what makes this framework such a powerful framework, is that what we're saying in thinking about instruction is it's not enough to have really good instruction. So I love when we hear that your child has come home and they've had a great day or the class was great. That's awesome. And that is how your child should feel every single day. But as the educators, we need to make sure that that instruction, it's going somewhere. It's on a path. That instruction is on a journey to some bigger ideas and bigger thinking and some clear goals for what we want to make sure our students know and are able to do. And the way that we get there is knowing and clarifying out that stage 2. Building our assessments so that they are linked to the first part of that unit planner. And then ultimately, if the teachers know what the instruction needs to look like because they've developed it and they're clear on how they're going to know, how they're assessing, then it gives them, that's the art of teaching. So we often talk about the art and science. The art of teaching is the gift that you have of the particular year of your child's teacher. And so we never want our teachers to all teach exactly the same way. That wouldn't be a good educational environment. We want our teachers to bring their loves and their passions and their joys of teaching and make each classroom look a little different. But we also want to make sure that every child in this district is getting a consistent and cohesive and comprehensive education the way that we have defined it. And that's what we believe this framework does provide for us. So with that, I am happy to pass the mic over to our building administrators who are going to, I think, bring to life some of what goes on in our schools to meet these goals.
Can we ask some questions now of you before?
So I thought
in terms of the district
We're
goals?
gonna go through it and ask questions after.
All
So
4 schools?
that's right. Thanks.
Good evening, it's a full house. Good evening, everybody. It's on?
It's on.
Members of the board, Dr. Core, Dr. Harrison, Ms. Stein. I'm Joyce Chapman, for those of you who I have not met yet. Looks like a lot of dazzling parents in our audience. So we have the pleasure, actually, it's great for me, we're going to present K-5. And so in thinking about our work and past presentations that we've done, I think it's important that everybody recognizes that so much of the work that we do is articulated K-5, yes, K-12, but we are the elementary school unit. And so when your kids come through Irvington, we do a lot of thinking, planning, talking, all of our work collaborating together so that the experience is cohesive and continuous for students as they enter kindergarten and then all the way up to the elementary school. Okay. So the first goal that you heard Dr. Gore and Dr. Harrison discuss to implement instructional practices that elevate student thinking and understanding. So in other words, teachers will. And so I'm not going to read the slide to you. What I am going to do is I'm going to give you some examples of how the work that we do with teachers actually will ultimately translate to the experience that our students have in the classroom. And so this happens for us K-5. There's a little bit of a difference, obviously, in building with what Dr. Kaur was saying, how teachers bring their own personality and their own perspective. But we do a lot of our work together with all of the teachers. And so an example is every year our teachers, K-12, they engage in goal-setting meetings. So they set goals for themselves as teachers. And their goals are connected to everything that you saw in what you heard earlier. And so as part of the goal-setting process, many of the teachers are linking it to using essential questions in the classroom. And so it's not about using essential questions, it's about pushing kids' thinking to a deeper level. And so when they think about doing that last year, as was alluded to earlier, is that this work has been ongoing. And so the way that we're pushing it forward is that we're moving from just posting the essential questions in the classroom to really pushing to how they're being used. And so they're being used through exit tickets, so students are responding to their learning about and around the essential questions at the end of at the end of a unit or end of a lesson through an exit ticket, but they're also perhaps now introducing the unit of study using the essential question and then revisiting it along the way to see how students' thinking is developing as teachers deliver the content throughout the unit. And another way that we are trying to see what the evidence will be that the student thinking is being pushed to a deeper level is that, for example, if we have a question like what is fair in math can be an essential question for, let's say, a fraction unit. And so then they go and they read aloud, and there is an element between characters happening in ELA, in the text that they're reading. And the question, what is fair, comes up. It's also one of our character building questions, what is fair? And the idea is that we want the thinking to transfer. We want our kids to develop their understanding related to what is fair in math, but then how does that relate to when you encounter that same question in another area of study? And so all of that work that the teachers are doing through their goal setting, and then ultimately we will observe teachers through the observation process and get to see classroom lessons that actually exemplify everything that I just described. Another example of how we're doing this work, supporting teachers to lay the foundation for the experience that's happening in the classrooms, is this past summer, I think it was 31 elementary school teachers, K-5, which is a lot of us, we're small, and all the elementary administration, we participated in a 3-day literacy institute with Shelley Harwain, who's a world-renowned educator, and we're so fortunate to have the opportunity to work with her ongoing. She's been here for many years. And in that institute, we spent time examining student work. And we examined the student work through the lens of what do we notice that our kids are able to do as readers and as thinkers, and what's our evidence in that, and what can we name in terms of their qualities of writing that they're already doing, and then what do we have to do to support them instructionally to raise the level of the work that we're seeing. And so there's another example of how we're really using our what's happening for the student to push what we're doing as teachers instructionally to get our kids to think at a deeper level.
Thank you, Joyce. So just to reiterate how Joyce began our presentation, this is a wonderful opportunity for Joyce and I to present as a K-5. We live in 2 separate buildings, but we are not separate. And everything that we do K-3 builds on a continuum so that we're preparing our students as they grow as 4th and 5th graders and then ultimately on to middle school and high school. So as Joyce shared, so much of the work related to this goal is about teachers and the work that we do to support them to ultimately implement instructional practices that are going to deepen the level of student thinking that goes on each and every day. How that looks to a kindergartner is very different to how it will look at a 5th grader. So by examining that continuum and really focusing on that stage 1 that Raina was able to share, starts with that essential question and gets fleshed out through the naming of the 4 instructional goals, from knowledge and skill onto making meaning and transfer, and what that looks and sounds like at each of the levels of our children. And how we do that, through the work that Joyce shared, there are some key terms that should bounce out at us. And those terms are collaboration and the looking at student work to examine the level of thinking that they're doing. So the use of the essential questions, as Joyce shared, it's also looking at what is it producing in our student thinking. And that will help examine the work that we do across the year. But our focus through collaboration with teachers, and this is the work that we do to support them, happens in different ways. And when we talk about instructional practices, we talk about intervisitations, getting teachers to collaborate through breaking down those walls between classrooms and getting them into each other's classrooms to examine the student work, the student thinking that's going on within a common unit. And we can do that, as Raina said, across a grade level, but we should also, one of our goals is to begin to do that longitudinally, vertically, where we look at kindergartners, teachers, looking at how that thinking builds on a K-3 continuum and ultimately through K-5. We do that through intervisitations, we do that through collaboration, through study groups, through the opportunities for teachers to explore topics like inquiry, topics that are related to deepening student thinking and what that looks like as instructional practices. You might hear things like accountable talk and station teaching, all these really awesome instructional practices that focus on knowledge and skill, but they create an experience for children that allows them to make meaning. And ultimately, our goal is always to have them transfer this to other experiences. One example which is not just Dow's Lane, it's K-5 is to work with our character. We do this through the collaboration, again, that's a key word, through committee, through teachers working with teachers, to really name out how our character building program grows K-5. We do this through a K-5 focus on mindfulness, and that mindfulness is a window into metacognition. The more we can build student thinking around where they are right there, what their presence is and their learning, the more they can self-reflect and begin to think about the habits of mind. So for Dow's Lane in particular, we're looking now at how each month ultimately grows to defining who they are, what that means K-3, and ultimately what that will mean at the Main Street School when they're thinking of themselves as global citizens. So in essence, building our instructional practices is really about deepening their thinking about themselves as learners, as well as themselves as part of this world. And I'm going to do the second slide. Okay, so our next goal really focuses on, as Raina and Dr. Harrison shared, it's really our launch. And it's our launch to look at assessment and what a balanced system of assessment looks and sounds like to our youngest learners and how it grows through the years. So one of the things that we like to think about when we're thinking of assessment, certainly as a K-5, the work that Joyce and I do with our staff is that we build a common understanding of who we work. We build a common understanding by looking at our instructional practices, looking at the data, the evidence of student thinking that happens each and every day as a window in to truly understand whether we have this balanced way of looking at assessment. One of the best examples that we can share K-5 is really the work around RTI, which is a response to intervention system, as well as a practice. So RTI is a tiered system of intervention where we are grounded in data using a universal screener where all of our children K-5 go through math and numeracy screening. But what we're also looking at this year is very deeply looking at what that data tells us about children, what it tells us about our struggling learners, as well as what it tells us about our learners who are advanced, and what decisions can we make for them to push their learning and their thinking forward. We're doing that not only through our data, through our universal screener, but we're trying to really define this year what are those other data points that create this balanced look at a student, the whole child, where they are developmentally, according to other benchmarks, but where are some of the places where we want to deepen our understanding of children in particular, in the area of comprehension, in the area of levels of thinking they have about themselves as readers and writers, but also as themselves as mathematicians, and how we move from fluency to the deeper levels of concept development, and ultimately if they're able to transfer their understanding of mathematics to different models of mathematics.
Link to that. So an example of how we are using the data, and we're building on the work that we did last year. So you've heard us many times speak about our amazing math instructional coach, Christine Rosner. So we have a model that's in place K-5 where we have math learning sessions. Ms. Rosner, she meets with a group of students, and our first math learning session actually this year, we were able to pull the New York State data, and we were able to actually pull our own students' work and look at how our students performed on particular questions, both our previous students to look for patterns in particular standards, how they performed, and identify our instructional practice connected to our unit planners, for where in our unit planners is there evidence that we address the instruction related to the questions and how our students perform. And so we actually have all of this information. And Dr. Carr actually at a recent board meeting mentioned the New York State test. And this is an example of the value of when we have the data that our students have taken the test, we actually now have the ability to use that data in a meaningful and purposeful way. And then the teachers are then equipped with strategies to go back into the classroom to really target and specifically teach into particular strategies with specific students in areas that we know are in need of support, and also places where they can push students that we know are successful in particular areas as well.
So, Mr. Sotile and Ms. Daly, so we could come up and talk about some of the work at the middle school.
You're a mess.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity for David and I to sort of share the work that's been happening at the middle school in the past year, and then also this year moving forward. That really reflects the two goals that Joyce and Deb just spoke to, and Dr. Kaur and Dr. beginning of the evening's presentation. So to start off, I'm going to talk about our first goal, which is a continuation of our work from last year, which has to do about implementing best practices that elevate and deepen student thinking. And then David will speak about assessment, but I just want to kind of say up front that these two goals, one can't exist without the other. We need to know what we want to measure, and then we need to figure out how we're going to measure it. So even though we're each speaking to a goal in a slide, it's definitely one feeds off the other or is the surface of the other. So in thinking about our work around elevating and teaching thinking, it really reflects stage one, which Dr. Kaur talked about, which is all about teacher planning. And the heart of all of the work we do at the middle school is all influenced by what is the teaching of thinking going to look like for our teachers and for our learners each and every day in the classroom. And when we think about this goal, there's different facets. So I'm going to kind of speak to 4 different areas that are highlighted in the evidence bullet to the right. But I really want you to be understanding that we have this one curriculum and it's teaching thinking, and everything we do is influenced by that agenda or objective. So one thing is that our teachers are immersed in instructional design. So they're using that UBD understanding by design framework that was referenced earlier in the presentation, and really being thoughtful about developing units and then day-to-day lessons that are really pushing those essential questions and essential understandings so students are grappling with big ideas. By having essential questions and essential understandings, teachers are always teaching with those big ideas in mind. They're connecting one day's lesson to the next so that students are, at the end of the year and beyond, able to transfer their learning to new situations, to apply it. Those are those transfer goals. We talked about the knowledge goals, the skill goals, the meaning making, and the transfer goals. So that is the heart of the work, and each discipline this year is working collaboratively to identify what are those transfer goals for my disciplines. And then we're working obviously horizontally, but also vertically with our high school counterparts as well. That's the heart, that's the end game, that's so what Dr. Kaur referenced earlier. How do we support teachers to engage in this very sophisticated, complicated work? One is through all the different professional learning experiences that we design collaboratively for them. That's through faculty meetings, that's through grade level learning sessions, that's all through the work that they do with outside consultants. I'm happy to share that all of the work that our teachers are doing with our support and outside consultants, again, are all focused on thinking. Example, our social studies department is focused on incorporating or integrating the historical thinking skills into their ongoing instruction. Another aspect of our support of teachers, which was referenced earlier by our colleagues, is through the goal-setting process that all teachers engage in at the beginning of the school year. Many of our teachers have goals that either reflect the first goal about teaching thinking, best practices to promote that, and also a lot of them have goals that reflect our second goal, which has to do with best assessment practices. In addition to that, as part of our observation and evaluation process, we are constantly asking teachers when we're meeting with them before a classroom visit, after a classroom visit, to take out that unit planner, to tell us like what learning goals informed this lesson. Is it more a knowledge-based lesson, a skill-based, a meaning-making? Are you teaching for transfer? Typically a lesson includes several of those learning goals, but we really want teachers to be clear about what are my teaching goals for today's learning, and then what are my goals for the entire unit of study, like what am I building towards? Another question we often ask teachers as part of our observation and evaluation process is, what's the level of thinking that you expect students to do during the day's lesson? And then we go in looking for evidence of that and then support. A lot of our teachers are engaged this year thinking about, if these are my transfer goals, what are those strategies I need to explicitly teach in a lesson to get students to move to that higher level of thinking? Another way that we're supporting the teaching of thinking this year is really to make clear the relationship between the teaching of thinking outside of like a typical core academic class. So what I mean by that is when we think about our character building programs, such as our advisory, which I've talked a little bit about in the past 2 years, this is our 3rd year of an advisory program, how do we teach thinking when we're also teaching social emotional learning?
And we want to make the connection, the relationship between those two evident to teachers and evident to students. So an example of the work we engaged in recently was this summer to support our advisory program and to build that relationship between social emotional learning and teaching thinking was I worked with a subcommittee of our character building committee for 2 days this summer, and we used the Understanding by Design framework to map out, to clearly articulate what is our long-term vision for our advisory program. What is the thinking that we want students to be able to do? What are those transfer goals? So it was a wonderful example of using the planner, the UBD framework, but using it as a way to really make clear our vision, which the committee developed this summer, and our next step is David and I will be sharing that with our entire staff, so that when our teachers, also known as advisors, are leading their advisory sessions, they're really teaching towards that goal of thinking, so that we have that common expectation and that common goal. The last 1 or 2 things I'm going to speak about in terms of thinking is we're very proud this year that we were able to introduce a new elective course for our 8th graders. It's one of the PLTW courses. It's called Green Architecture. And our long-term goal is to be able to provide a more comprehensive elective program to all of our students to promote choice, voice, and all of the courses that I know many of you are familiar with from the elementary grades that are Project Lead the Way are all about promoting thinking, critical thinking skills, and green architecture is just one example of doing that type of work. So now I'm going to give the microphone to David.
Thanks, Allison. So thanks everyone for the opportunity to speak tonight. Mike, I guess I want to start with a question. How do we know what we think we know? Right? That's the question that we began with this year, and that is really the question that speaks to this idea of assessment. How do we know what we think we know? How do we think we know? How do we know what we think we know about students? How do we know what we think we know about what students have learned or can do or are thinking, their level of development, and so on and so forth? As we get into this year, as we've gotten into this year and are beginning to make progress toward our goals, this notion of assessment and specifically that term balanced assessment system is really at the top of our minds. And this idea of being able to really articulate how we know things about kids is really central to that work. You know, for a long, long time, we've been able to say we know certain things about students because of the way that we've tested them. But what that tells us and what we actually know based on a very traditional style of testing is quite limited. And so we can continue to test and we can continue to gather data in ways that are quite traditional in nature, and we'll know a lot about levels of knowledge at particular points in time, and maybe even a little bit about certain skills at certain points in time. But as we've worked through this notion of teaching thinking, as we've made that our work, our central focus across our curriculum, across our programs, the idea of saying, how do we know what we think we know about students as thinkers has taken on a more important role. And that's really where we find ourselves really putting the thrust of our professional learning this year, of the activity of our teachers when we think about some of the goal setting that Allison mentioned, some of the professional learning that Dr. Harrison and Dr. Kaur and Allison and our other elementary principals have mentioned. And so we've really begun to engage teachers in developing that common understanding of what a balanced assessment system is, of being able to incorporate the types of assessment that will both serve as teaching tools, as it was known as a formative assessment, along with checkpoints along the way that are actual measures of where students are achieving, whether it's knowledge, whether it's skill, whether it's the ability to transfer or to do that deeper thinking. That takes a lot of time. That takes a lot of work. That is a long-term aspirational goal for us that we're beginning to work toward this year. And I think I've said before in this room, I know I've said it to others, it's when you begin to think about what assessment can look like and how assessment can look different that you really begin to see the change in instruction take place. When we talk about designing instruction in stage 1 of the unit planner that Dr. Kaur was talking about, and we talk about naming out results that we want to see for our students relative to thinking and skill and so forth, you see that actually take place. You see the instruction that makes that happen take place when you can really name what assessment is going to look like. And that's really the work that we're doing right now. And like I said, that's hard work for us. So over the course of this year, what we're working on is we're working with teachers to both develop, like I said, that common language around balanced assessment. You saw that long definition that we as administrators put together, and so I've never accused an administrator of being short-winded. Certainly not this one. So, but that's work. That common understanding is the first step in doing that work, and from there we look to build assessments that we think can give us some window in, some evidence of student thinking in different ways. We look to say, what are some of those learning tasks, those performance activities that we might have used in a class previously, and how can we maybe use some of them as an assessment? How do we take something that was an engaging task for students and perhaps gather some data from it, gather some evidence of student thinking along the way, whether that's via student reflection, whether that's checking in on students in process, looking to create assessments of process. That's a big thing that teachers are wrestling with and thinking about right now. So those are some examples of things that we're going to be working on over the course of the year. And one of the things I think we want to get to, certainly it's a goal for this year, but it's a goal that reaches beyond this year, is this true alignment between what we see in stage 1 of our unit planners, which are the results that we're seeking, and the assessments that we've designed or are developing in stage 2, and really begin to see this assessment clearly shows us where we stand, where our students stand relative to these results, whether they be knowledge, skill, or student thinking. That's the work of this year. That's the work that will go beyond this year. But our teachers are getting engaged in this work right now. I think I just want to make a really brief mention, although it warrants much more talking than this, of the second outcome that's listed up on the slide, and that has to do with our work toward the creation of an RTI plan for the middle school. That's work that you heard the elementary principals reference, and work that has really grown from the elementary level on up. And we're in process right now of developing our own plan. Allison, leading that work at the middle school, but doing it in collaboration with a lot of other really thoughtful professionals on our staff. So that's good work, and that is really tied very closely to this idea of
Can I just interrupt? Can you explain RTI?
Sure. RTI stands for Response to Intervention. It is a method of gathering or identifying interventions for students that have demonstrated some level of need relative to some particular area of learning, behavioral, could be any number of different things. Getting very targeted in terms of what the student's need is, naming a specific intervention, and implementing that intervention and monitoring the progress that students demonstrate in response to that intervention, and then making decisions programmatically about students going from there. So that's it in probably a microcosm. But in any case, so again, that is part and parcel with the work of assessing and assessing the whole child, and using assessment as a means of improving and constantly growing our instruction. But again, that's some heavy lifting that's involved in creating an RTI plan, especially at the middle level. So two big areas for us, and we're proud of and excited to be doing over the course of this year.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now we move on up the K-12 ladder to our high school, Mr. Samuelson and Mr. Cohen.
Thanks, everyone. I know that when we started with the school's presentation that Deb and Joyce got up here and talked a lot about a K-5 continuum. In many ways, with the high school being able to talk now, I think we have an opportunity to really talk about a full district continuum. And with so much alignment between the elementary schools, what you're also going to hear is how there's so much alignment between the middle school and the high school. And I just want to start by saying, Allison made reference to it, but our work around our department chairs as instructional leaders has really been such an important and critical aspect of making sure that the work at the middle school and the high school has a lot of continuity. I just say that because you're going to hear a lot of similarities, but we're also going to be able to talk about the distinct nature of the high school and kind of what sets it apart. And, you know, one of the things that's always so unique of a high school is that when we think of the continuum in a district, we really think of our high schools as these end games. You know, how does it all come together for our high school students, and how do we look at how all this great work in any district, but certainly here in Irvington, K-12 is getting our students prepared and ready to move on in their post-secondary lives. So, you know, I think back to the beginning of the presentation and some of the work that Dr. Kaur did, and what she started to spell out for us is really our focus around thinking, how it really is our curriculum K-12. But she also started talking about the 4 learning goals and the distinctive nature of being able to recognize knowledge and skill as well as meaning making and transfer. And when I think of high school teachers, I think it's a perfect way to talk about how that comes together. Because often when we're talking about high school, we're talking about really dense and rigorous content. And often in the past, we've thought of that as our curriculum. But what's amazing here in Irvington, what I think we've really been evolving with it at the high school level, is that you can't talk about that as curriculum unless you're also building in the meaning making and thinking, the transfer of that content. So ultimately, that has been such a great focus for all of us. But at the high school level, if you can recall back last year, when we started to make a shift as a district between planning and implementation, we set 2 major priorities at the high school. One was implementation of essential questions, and the other was to really looking at our daily lessons and this important nature of closure. And we did it through activities, student-centered activities, to help focus on that closure at the end of lessons. And it's important that I mentioned sort of the work last year, because I think our work this year is truly a deeper and next layer step of that work. Because this year, it's not just enough to implement essential questions. It's really an important understanding of how we're using them. And the same thing with our closing activities. And ultimately, it brings me back to what I said a few minutes ago, which is those 4 learning goals. Those 4 learning goals are the opportunity as educators for us to make distinctions. And I think being able to make distinctions is what sets professionals apart, and it's the focus that we're having at the high school this year. So we're engaged in a number of activities. You heard it from my colleagues, whether it's through the observation cycle, which starts with goal setting, or whether it's going to be other layers of professional learning that we've set up at the high school, and that includes everything from our faculty meetings to the work that we have with the different coaches and consultants that we're bringing in, and now it's amongst us in all 5 of our core subject areas, or through something I've talked about, which is our double period meetings that we've established at the high school over the last few years. We now have really strong infrastructures to make those distinctions, to have teachers looking at unit planners and to figuring out now the link between stage 1, the planning, and stage 3, and what I would talk about in this slide, which is those daily lessons that they're creating. So when they're creating those closing activities, what are they targeting? What is the learning goal for the day? So often we may want to have a learning goal that is really knowledge-based and around the purity of the content. But on other days, it may be really important that we're setting those closing activities, and we want to gear it towards the meaning making or the transfer. So by taking the time with our teachers now, whether it's in a learning model as whole groups or whether it's in a coaching model with our coaches and for Matt and myself to do in the observation cycle, we can ask those questions up front, and we can give our teachers feedback around how they're doing. So it's really, this slide I think about is, this is about the teacher thinking. This is about how teachers consider the steps that they want to take in order to elevate student thinking. You know, similar to our colleagues in the other schools, there's this slide around student thinking and instructional design, and the next slide is going to be about assessment. So in the assessment piece, you're going to hear more about how we want students thinking and how we look at how they demonstrate that. So another area that we're going to do this year in our double period meetings is we're going to ask teachers to come in with closing activities that they've And we're gonna ask them, so which of the 4 learning goals is this one closing activity target, or maybe it's a couple of them. And then asking the colleagues to work together to look at student work, not necessarily to assess the students, but to assess the design. So are we truly getting results of students that speak into the distinctions that we're trying to make? Is it really talking about meaning making? Is it really talking about how we can understand if they're getting the knowledge that we want them to get? And through those distinctions, it really supports this model ultimately of teaching for thinking. The other point and the other outcome that I want to speak to is the use of Google Classroom. And ultimately, the outcome that we're looking for is to elevate collaboration between teachers and students. Last year, we wanted and encouraged teachers to use Google Classroom. This year, it's an expectation for all teachers at the high school to use Google Classroom. And again, similar to how I described last year's goal around essential questions and closing activities, this year it's about just getting everybody to use it and around some standard things. So posting with homework assignments and some of those core pieces of information that we in the past had thought of as on being that function. What we can then use our time this year is to understand the next steps and to start anticipating how Google Classroom really can become an even richer tool for our teachers and our students in that learning process. So, you know, as I mentioned, this is all about the design, the teaching thinking from the teacher standpoint. Now Matt's going to talk more from the assessment and what we want to see from our students.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks for having us tonight and this chance to speak about our work this year. As has been said over and over again this evening, our curriculum truly is thinking. And this year, we're starting to focus our energies on developing a balanced assessment system that gives both teachers insight into how our students are thinking, but also students a sense of ownership of their own development and their own thinking and development process. So what this means over time is it's developing a system of assessments that are balanced between measuring the degree and depth of content, knowledge, and skill, but also the ability to assess for student thinking. We're looking at developing new tools that give us insight into not only what our students are thinking, but more importantly, how they're developing their ability to derive new understandings independently, which is the meaning making, and then eventually the transfer that comes with it. Dave started off by talking about solid instructional design, and of course what comes with that is the assessment that follows to let us know the degree to which our design is effective, and also the degree to which our students are mastering or hoping they master. Our second goal is aiming more at student outcomes. It starts with the closing activities that we implemented last year, where teachers were asked to put together formative assessments and ended lessons to measure the degree to which students mastered that day's learning episode. For teachers, teachers is a great way to see the degree to which the lesson was effective. But for students, that closing activity gives them a sense of what they need to be doing next. Did I get today's lesson? Did this thing really sink in for me? If not, then I have next steps in front of me that I have to implement to make sure that I can gather that information before the unit gets away from me. That's important ownership. That's an important sense of my own process as a student, and we're looking to develop tools that really push that. What's more, we're excited to think about this year is post-assessment activities that follow more summative assessments. So very often students get back papers and tests and projects, and what they sadly tend to do is they look at the number on top of it, it's the grade, and that's where the conversation ends for them. It's 87, it's 93, I'm satisfied, I'm dissatisfied, and that's really how it ends. What we're hoping to do this year is develop post-assessment activities that ask kids to reflect upon their own process. Yeah, my number is 87, but here's why. Here's where I struggled, here's where I was successful. And based on my own interpretation of my own process, I know what I need to be doing now. And that's a skill. That's a process that students need to be taught how to do. That's a documented activity that needs to teach into that skill. But over time, the idea is that as we go forward, the number becomes less valuable and the feedback, teacher feedback, the language, the rubric analysis, the teacher spends so much time putting into for the students, that's becoming the more valuable piece for the kids. The other exciting thing this year that we're working towards is the RTI piece that David spoke about a few minutes ago. We're looking to develop a building level RTI protocol that hinges on meaningful data analysis. And that starts with getting a clear understanding of what data we have in our relatively awash in data, but not all data is valuable, and data is only useful if you make good use of it. So we're talking about creating a very clear and easily accessed and usable data set that we can use to get a clear sense of where specific student problems lie for individual students and also for cohorts. And we're using that information to develop tailored, a la carte, personalized interventions that we can track over time with students so that we can support their needs and push their areas of strength. Where we find those interventions aren't working, we can use further data to implement follow-up interventions to make sure that we are addressing their needs over time. Truthfully, we're really very excited about the work this year. The assessment piece is the natural progression of the work we did last year, and we're excited to share with you in January and then at the end of the year all the exciting things we've done. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we break into departments, of course, then. And we have 3 different departments that will be represented. Unfortunately, Mr. McCormick isn't able to be here tonight due to a family emergency. But we're certainly going to speak to PPS goals, which is Pupil Personnel Services. So Gail and Kimberly. And Kimberly, first time giving a public
Yes.
presentation in Irvington.
Yes, the new team.
And, yeah, and we need lower mics for you, for people. They need accommodation.
So, good evening, everyone, and thank you, of course, for allowing us to talk tonight through our goals. This is the first time for PPS, and I think before we talk through what our goals are, just to break out a couple of things about PPS. And listening to our colleagues, all this time before, I think it's important to recognize that PPS does sit in support of every building. We are pre-K through 21 department, which is all-encompassing, and I don't necessarily think we always capture that. But I think what's so exciting for us at this point, Mr. Kimberly and I as a new team, is really, for lack of a better expression, digging in with our building partners and really start delving into what our students need and what we as PPS can help and support. And then separate from that, what are our own distinct goals as a department. So before we go into those goals, for the purpose of our audience and the board, to really tell you what PPS is. So we shorten Pupil Personnel Services to PPS, but that is a very large body of people. So it's not only special education teachers, it is our related service providers, which could be speech language pathologists, occupational therapists, physical therapists, psychologists, vision, and then also our nurses, our ENL teachers. So we are a big, great department, and I just wanted to lay that out for everybody before we start our goals. And as I said before, as a new partnership, Kimberly and I really wanted to take a look at our buildings as needs and recognize where we want to start our work. And we started off our summer with really sitting down with each of our building administrative teams and really talking through what do you see as our strengths as a department, and then of course what are our areas of growth. And from that, we then took those answers, and they were great, to then really our whole department as a whole in our opening day, and our exercise was very similar. We're going to talk through what we see as our strengths collectively, and then where do we want to grow as a department, and then obviously individually. And from that work has come our goals. So first and foremost, our collaboration amongst our special ed teachers, our general education teachers, and our related service providers to help support our instructional planning. And one of the things that was clear is that how do we really support our students? What are we using and what tools are we using every day to support our students? And we thought about really, it was at our secondary level, our support classes, and really then the work of what can be a collaboration between our special education teachers and our content area specialists to really take unit planners that everyone has referenced before and really lift from there the skills and knowledge we want our students to have so that they can meet those higher level thinking, and so that's really what our support is. I'm going to turn it over to Kimberly to talk about our assessment briefly.
All right, I think it was David who said that no administrator has ever been accused of being short-winded, so I'm going to see if I can try as my first step here. So it's a very exciting time to come to Irvington, and especially with assessment as being my big thing. I'm a data nerd. I don't know, data, and everyone, when we say show us the data, that's really a lot of times what BPS and special education is known for good or for bad, but we usually, a lot of our professionals, Gail and myself, that's really where our training came in. We learned to analyze data. So
So what our real goal is to now bring our professionals to being collaborative with our buildings, with our general education teachers in the planning process, to make sure that the analysis of the data is really deriving the instruction in the classrooms. So our goal for our special educators and related service providers is to use multiple measures of assessment to define students' needs in order to inform instruction. This isn't, we use data a lot, but a lot of times when we think of special education, we think of the fix-it model, right? Let's look at the data, let's see what, it's like, all right, let's look at it now and fix it. But we want to look at data to say, all right, we have these data points. I use the example of a psychological evaluation, IQ test. There's a subtest called working memory, for example, which if we know a student has this kind of score in working memory, how can we support them in instruction in order to keep them moving forward? So we have the data, we have great professionals who can analyze the data. Now let's start collaborating with our classroom teachers to help our students moving forward. So far, each of our related service departments and special educators are working together to identify a toolkit for diagnostic and instructional assessments in order to provide consistent data for determining students' present levels of performance. So we're really looking for some consistency as well, so that we know every year that these are some of the measures that we're looking at in order to know, have our students progressed? Are they making gains? What are we doing? What can we change if they're not making gains? And this isn't just yearly data, this is also ongoing data throughout the school year to make sure that we're changing instructional practices as we go for students' needs. Central to this work is also defining the role of the case manager to include the analysis of diagnostic and instructional assessment data in order to enhance instructional planning. And that's it. I think we did it. So, all right.
So a bit of a different turn, then we'll look to Mr. Levinsky, who's going to talk about the areas of technology and innovation. And where Jesse has always been our leader of technology, this is his first year in truly leading from an administrative standpoint, now being a member of the administrative team. So welcome, Jesse.
How you liking the hours?
Oh, it's so great. So great to be here. So I guess the best place to start is to kind of talk about this word innovation, right? Because I think it means a lot of different things to different people. And I think the way we define it, most people when they approach about innovation, they think it's new and shiny. And that's not really our approach to it. When we talk about the word innovation, we're not only talking about those things that are new, but we're also talking about iterating on the things that currently exist. So taking those processes, the things that already exist within the structures of our district, and improving upon them. So with this first goal, we're talking about instructional practices, and there's kind of two angles to this with technology and innovation. The first is through this idea of student voice, choice, and agency. So providing students the ability to really have ownership over the learning process. This summer we actually engaged in a few experiences designed to start to help educators in the district start to build upon those ideas for the school year. So we actually had a couple opportunities around Genius Hour at the elementary school. We had a cohort of teachers who gathered together to work on passion-based projects for students at the elementary level. We actually hosted a masterclass workshop where we brought in 3 authors of educational technology books, the focus of those books were actually on lesson design around the UBD planner. So the idea was the work continued, they met with those authors over the summer, did a day of work, and then there's going to be some ongoing work that happens over the course of the year, with that work then translating into the unit planner. The other piece was an IEF-funded grant around Google Expeditions. It was something we were looking into for a long time. We actually started that work this summer. We'll continue it next week at Superintendent's Conference Day. We've already started pushing that content out also as a way of enriching student experiences.
Can you just a sentence or two on Google Expeditions?
Sure. So it's a not quite augmented reality, but essentially students can, Google has made available 600 expeditions. Each expedition contains 7 high-quality images developed around a particular theme. Each of those images also comes with guiding questions and content that teachers can use to help drive the instruction. And every student in the class is issued a viewer with the device inside, and when they are looking at a particular image, it's actually an immersive 360, kind of like Google Cardboard, where they can look around and actually explore the area. The teacher has a tablet in front of them, which allows them to tap on a particular area of the image and then draws every student toward that location, so they can actually have some control as opposed to students being isolated that was exciting on that front. The other thing is, in addition to those opportunities for voice, choice, and agency, to increase just the number of opportunities available for these types of experiences. So in the technology front, we've actually expanded PLTW to 5th grade, as well as the addition of a green architecture course at the middle school. We continue to find ways to offer additional technology opportunities to students. I mentioned Genie's Hour earlier, those passion-based projects at the elementary level. Part of that work over the summer was to increase the amount of that opportunity that we were providing to students to do some of that passion-based work. And the other piece was Student Innovation Fund. So we've actually expanded the opportunities around the Innovation Fund. We're going to have our kickoff meeting this Thursday. Innovation Fund, if you're not aware, is a partnership between the district and the Irvington Education Foundation, where we essentially provide students the opportunity to seek funding for projects that they deem to be of a benefit to not just the school, but the broader school community. So a lot of exciting projects have already come out of that. We've already looked on ways to how do we then take the work we're doing with the Innovation Fund to the next level, and we're excited to see that happen this year.
Great.
Okay, so the assessment piece. You know, we've been collecting data around technology use for quite a while, and the main vehicle we've used, and it was mentioned a couple times, is Clarity data. So we've actually been collecting data from teachers, students, and parents, students 312, over the past 2 years, twice a year. So what we have now is the ability to, as we start to go into the 30-year data collection, start to look at this longitudinal data of technology use on a bunch of different fronts. So they have a framework. The Clarity data is broken up into a framework that actually aligns pretty closely with our technology plan, which is based around the ISTE standards. ISTE is the International Society for Technology and Education. So it's the most established set of standards around technology use. As we start to look at this data now, we can start to use that to help make some decisions about where we're going. Not just in terms of device usage, but more in terms of the instruction that we're delivering for our students. The other piece, and it's mentioned up there, is G Suite, but if you're unfamiliar with that term, G Suite is the new term for Google Apps for Education. They just simply rebranded it. We have a cohort of teachers that have been working with the tools and with myself over the past 2 years who now are out in the field delivering support to teachers. What we've been doing is a couple of things. We've been measuring the types of support that we've been doing for teachers and ultimately trying to shift what that support looks like. So at the beginning of any type of support initiative around a new product, you're always looking at productivity type of support, meaning how do I use the tool? Now what we're doing is shifting that from how do I use the tool to how do I actually embed this tool as part of the bedrock of the instruction that we're doing. That's a really important shift, because now it's not a matter of how do I use it from a functional standpoint, but how do I actually use it to improve instruction and outcomes for our students. The last piece I'll talk about is actually kind of highlighted in green. One of the things there is dispositional thinking. So one of the things we're particularly excited about is exploring a new problem-based approach to how do we as a district start to tackle some of these broader challenges. And when I talk about challenges, I don't mean from a technology standpoint. I mean just systematically, how do we address problems? And we're looking into a model, or to launch a model that's actually based on the Stanford D-School's design thinking model, which actually looks to empathy and actually considering when you're designing a solution to a problem, how do you actually factor in the views of the stakeholders, meaning students, teachers, as opposed to us making a decision in isolation as an administration or as a staff, but really looking into the motivations of the people involved before we start to tackle problems. And I'm sure we'll hear more about this as the year goes on. We're really excited about it. And yeah.
Great. Thanks.
I am not Mr. McCormick, but just like all of his colleagues, there's a number of goals that Marty is undertaking in the area of athletics. So when we look at his first objective, this idea of bolstering some pride and spirit within the athletic department, and he's looking at really developing a comprehensive approach that's going to hit on a number of different measures. One that you're going to be hearing about in this coming week, it's going to be rolled out along in coordination with Homecoming, is the launch of the Bulldog Booster Club, an organization to be able to support all of our athletic programs in the schools. But then he's looking to go a bit deeper and looking to try to develop culture within the department where there's lots of opportunities for feedback and data from students in and around how their experiences have been, looking for new opportunities, and to get a little bit of window into what the student experience is through the athletic department. But then we have to think about program sustainability, looking at opportunities for growing programs where possible. And Artie's looking to, not only within the school district, but partnering with the village to develop some initiatives to help support programs where we're seeing lower levels of participation, or seek opportunities to implement some new experiences for our kids. And the final piece has been the rollout of an athletics handbook and its introduction and use across all programs, all 3 sports seasons as well. And so here, looking, following that theme of looking at assessments, and I maybe tip the cap a little bit and thinking about already looking for those opportunities for opportunities to be able to grow within the department. So here, looking for shifts. So there's a piece of it where we're looking for that type of feedback from our student athletes, but also mirroring some of the work that's happening in our schools and going through a goal-setting process and an observation process for our coaches, which would be a new initiative for us. We're also looking at taking the annual surveys that Artie's been doing and trying to identify opportunities linked to budgetary requests to be able to plan for the future of the program. But really that sustainability piece that I referenced before, we recognize there's lots of shifts, and we see some sports that are really growing rapidly. So we see that popularity of lacrosse, we see growing popularity in soccer, but we see field hockey numbers struggling, football numbers declining, baseball and softball even in some cases. So through this process, Artie wants to be able to develop a clear vision of what our needs are, see what we can do to be able to support program growth, but then also look for new experiences where they may be available. So, and then finally, when we think about where we are, I can say that the administrative team met today, and we worked through our presentation, which was intended to be about 45 minutes. So you can see we're right on target. And this has been a part of a process for us. And we've gone down a path over the years of looking to find the right way to define goals, trying to find ways to be able to articulate our work and objectives for the district. Fully acknowledging that this is a step in the direction. The fact that we're talking, something that was an hour rather than 45 minutes shows that there's still work to be done on our end. But the thing that I want to really reinforce, and the thing that I want to think about is, I can speak to my experience. I can speak to stories that I've been told by other folks, but our schools have moved because of this work. We're in a different place today than we were 6 years ago. I can remember entering the district and thinking about the challenges that we faced. And the work that we're doing now is some of the heaviest lifting that I've ever seen. And it's such a talented group of people, and I look to my right and then to my left, my colleagues, but I kind of got to swivel my head all the way around to think of all the hard work, all the deep work that's happening in our classrooms. So, we're really proud of where we are. We know that there's still, like anywhere, work to be done. But we're proud to say that we know that this work is going to move us forward. That goals are going to continue to remain a central focus throughout the school year. We look forward to continuing to kind of refine process, looking forward to mid-year updates as well as models to be able to report back on this. And at the end of the year, we're going to break this into 2 nights, and we're going to let the administrators bring these experiences to life for you, to be able to see what has happened in their schools and their classrooms, to be able to report back on the evidence and success that they've had in the areas where we still have some progress. But I certainly want to thank the board and the large public attendance tonight for the attention, and we certainly look forward to fielding any questions that you may have, Mike.
Excellent. So I think we'll begin with questions from the board. And I know, having talked with you, that I think each of us have some areas where we have maybe some more focus. I'd like to model our questions following the presentation, and so in that sense that we would go through, and not everyone is obligated to ask a question in each round, but essentially starting with the theories of action, strategic planning, overarching goals for this year, then the district, K through 5, secondary. That allows us also, when we're asking questions, to have specific staff be available to answer those questions you might have. And while you prepare your first questions, I'll just start with one related to a question, just piggybacking on Deb here, that last year when we talked about assessment, that was following up on the work that's been done in terms of developing that articulated curriculum that, every grade K through 12. We know the units, the teachers have developed units, and in shifting those units, you then have to shift assessments. When we talk about assessment, I think that's what we were talking about last year. And this year, it's the assessment, we're using it in a somewhat different way perhaps, in that we're looking at data in a systemized way to basically make decisions and inform practice on a larger level rather than an individual unit. Would that be, you want to do a better job of that than I did?
You didn't do a bad job, Michael. No, I think I understand what you're saying, but I just want to make sure I'm clarifying. So last year we talked really specifically about stage 1. We really didn't talk about stage 2. What was happening was, as teachers were designing their curriculum or their classroom instruction based on stage 1, what we found and what we hope they found, stage one being the planning, stage 1 being the instructional design, stage 2 being the assessment of the instructional design. So when you look at the planner, you can see, without seeing a lot of specific, stage 1 is rather large. There's a lot of components to stage 1. So stage 1 has enduring understandings, essential questions, knowledge, skill, and thinking. Stage 2 is assessment. And so stage 2 is assessment, assessing all of those areas. So what we found, and this is good news, we found that teachers were redesigning stage 1, but initially they were putting their old assessment into stage 2. Well, when they gave that assessment, what they're starting to see is, oh, wait, these aren't aligned. So yes, what you said is true. We talked a little bit about stage 2, but this year our focus is, and David said that, it's our question, how do we know? Stage 2 this year is the focus. Last year, stage 1 was still the focus. We were dipping our toe in stage 2. And again, I can't say this often enough and loud enough. We've been assessing for years. We've been teaching for years. It's not like we've been on hold all these years. I think what we're talking about is the refinement of practice.
But isn't there two pieces? I mean, so I think that's one piece, which is looking within the classroom to what's being the instruction and now the assessment. We're also talking about inventorying the different systems of how we assess in different grades, to be able to look at it sort of in the bigger picture, outside of a single classroom, or a single area of instruction, to say, well, what I think, to quote Mr. Samuelson, what is well, I can't quote him, I guess, but essentially that
it's program evaluation.
It's program evaluation.
Right.
So it's not. I mean, one's about units of instruction, the other is about program.
Right, and it comes from a couple of different places. So Joyce referred to that as well. So Joyce talked about the data that we're collecting, looking at our state data, looking at our Ames web data. Right. So by looking at our Ames web data, ultimately what we're going to be able to do. So remember, we have 1 year behind us. Actually, in 2 weeks we have a full-day workshop on using the data from Ames Web and generating reports and reading reports. I think what will be an area of focus for us will be is, as we're looking at our Ames Web data, it's going to start to inform our understanding of our program. So in other words, if we're seeing students who are not able to demonstrate a certain skill, well, is that because we're not teaching it well enough, or we're not teaching it at all, or we're not teaching it often enough? Or is it for some reason a very difficult skill for kids to master? So our Ames web data is going to help us to look at our program. What are we seeing across versus what are we seeing in an individual student, which speaks more to what Kimberly and Gail talked about. How does individual student data inform the needs of an individual child?
Great. So the two keywords that come out of that are sort of the curriculum of a classroom and the program view. So with that in mind, if anyone wants to start off with some questions related to sort of those big theories of action, linkages to the strategic plan, or our overarching goals, does anyone want to pose any questions related to those?
Well, I'm happy to kick off.
Go.
I still struggle with the theories of action and how they align back with the strategic plan. It was clear to me in the beginning of the presentation where you talked about, well, planning strategically, but I wrote that, aligning with the strategic plan, and you had the goals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that had been taken from the strategic plan. And then the district goals showed very clearly, which goals, which strategic objectives they were in alignment with, as did, all the district goals. So develop the model for long-range financial planning is strategic objective number 5. Continue to enhance communications, different goals against that are strategic objective 4, 5, 2, 5, 5. So when we got here, I sort of got lost in, where these aligned with, to achieve our vision. These are the things that we wanted to do. And I think my perspective on the strategic plan and how it would flow through was that and I think this is the way it's supposed to be done, is the board sets the vision, with input from the community, which is exactly what was done, and then the administration should then take those goals and align the activities around the implementation of those goals. So the path that you went down, though, were 4 learning goals, and I guess I'm still struggling. There's a learning goal in there, but there were other goals that, weren't reflected in the presentation.
Yeah,
and I understand you're saying that this is in process, but I was looking for more of that. I was looking for more of the alignment with the strategic vision that was set forth in January.
So let me just make sure I understand, because I'm not sure that because maybe I think I see connects that aren't there, right? That maybe we could have laid out a little bit differently so that you could see them too.
Absolutely, and I even wrote some of those down. So for instance, character building at Dow's Lane and habits of mind would certainly fall into the goal number 4 of creating active participants in society, right? Or the high school goal of the Google Classrooms could be goal number 1, integrating technology, or, Jessie and innovation could be goal number 4, or Artie could be number 5 with, creating a, school spirit. So I saw that, but what I didn't see it tightly aligned in the presentation.
So, and we can certainly just create a quick reference chart. I mean, every single goal that the administrators wrote, every piece that they did is specifically aligned to one of these 6.
So that wasn't transparent.
Right, okay, so that's helpful. Sure, so that's a quick chart that we could certainly share.
And, well, I understand that the goal of data, is a good goal. I would assume that would be in the achievement of any of the goals. So if I'm creating a global citizen, what are my benchmarks for that? And then what are the data points that are telling me I'm creating global citizens, for instance? So that was my struggle with particularly the curriculum aspect.
Yeah, and I think a part of it, as Raina indicated, that work is there and that work has been done. And so we're looking at that transition from one place to another and where we're going in developing and designing, articulating in goals. So as Raina indicated, that piece is there. As I said in the beginning of the presentation, we have a framework that has been utilized and implemented in every school and every department. But it's very jargon heavy, and this transition and this pivot was, I wanted to demonstrate that we have models like this in place, and the intent was to try to bring it to life a little bit, so we just weren't looking at charts on paper, and to add some voice. So to Raina's point, that I think there's that opportunity to just come up with a clean-cut document that spells it out for everything across the board.
Well, and I think, the community spent an awful lot of time putting together what, their expectations of the district were, and then the strategic plan sort of map those out. So it would be nice to see how every piece of your work is aligning with what their expectations are.
Yeah, no, that's fair. It just take us the time to put it in one document.
It's always just a pivot table.
In this area, any other questions?
Yeah, I just can't find it. I wrote it down like 45 minutes ago, and I gotta find it.
First few pages.
Yes, I know that. Thank you. So you talked a lot about, I thank you for clarifying a minute ago, despite my question, is that, because last year's presentation essentially had the same goals verbatim. So I was wondering, you know, I mean, I'm looking at it, so literally verbatim, and I started to worry as I was listening about, you know, that we had these goals at the beginning of 2016-17 school year, and here we are seeing these goals again at the beginning of the 2017-18 school year. And then without any sort of gap filled in to say, well, okay, so you said a minute ago we dipped our toe a little bit last year. So I'm curious to know, and I'll give a specific example of what I'd love to know is, you know, what did we learn from dipping our toe in that pool last year? Like, for example, you know, I can only use my own personal reference. My son was in 5th grade, and he took, and in 4th grade and in 3rd grade, took math assessments from the units of study from Engage New York. And each year, those assessments were basically the same at the end of the unit. I mean, I could, you know, the folders are the same. So I'd love to know this year what last year and the previous 2 years taught us about creating balanced assessment and being innovative around, you know, designing stronger assessment or incorporating different kinds of assessment and so on. That was number one. And I guess really an overarching question I had, and I'm still confused about the evidence sections of each. But I guess I'll have to ask that with the.
Well, why don't you start with the first one, and then.
Yeah, we'll start with that one. Okay.
Oh, sorry. I was sorry, I was listening, I was waiting for the segue. So I'm not really sure how to answer that, to tell you the truth. I mean, I understand your question, and we certainly could share with you. I think there's a couple of different pieces. We actually changed some of our practice with the teachers. I know that this is a really hard thing to hear, but change is really slow. And so when I would say that last year was the first year that we were able to really use that math data to think about what we were doing well and what we weren't doing well. So what happens then over the summer is Christine Rosner, is our math coach, works with the classroom teachers, and they redesign aspects of the curriculum. So I would say that what we've learned is reflected in how they've changed. They redesign lessons and they redesign assessments. And so that's what you would see moving into next year, the redesign of curriculum and instruction based on those assessments. Is that what you mean, Dave?
Yes, but I'm trying to figure out what we can see, right? Like, I saw the same end of unit assessments that I saw the year before, and this year, so what you're saying to me is this year, when I see at the end of Unit 1 in a couple of weeks, or whenever it is, in math in 6th grade now, I'm going to see a revised assessment, or am I going to see the same assessment?
Okay, so I'm sorry, just clarify for me. But each year, your child's in a different grade, so when you say you see the same assessment, just clarify what you mean.
You're talking about developing a balanced assessment, correct? Right?
Right.
Formative, summative, performance-based.
Oh, you're talking about the assessment system. I'm
talking
sorry.
about the goal that you have set out in front of us.
Right, so that's an assessment system. So what we've done is we've increased the use, and it's not about at the end of a unit, a balanced assessment system, and maybe we need to clarify that better.
But even throughout the unit, right? So again,
Right, so it's formative, so balanced assessment, and you heard you heard Dave and Matt speak to closing activities. What we're saying is that we want to rely on some standardized data, but we also want to rely on formative. We want to rely on those, and when formative, just to clarify, exit tickets, mid-unit assessments at the secondary level, quizzes. So when we say balanced assessment system, what we're saying is we don't want to take one assessment and say, this is who this child is because they performed this way on this day.
We've had this conversation before, a bunch of times, and I understand that. When I look at a math unit of study as my example, I just trying to be clear. We're using the Engage New York curriculum, right? In the past, I haven't seen it yet this year, but in the past, so last year, it was using the Engage New York curriculum, right?
Yes.
I love it personally, so I track and I follow his homework and his exit tickets and his quizzes every single night, every week, right? And everything came out of the produced curriculum from Engage New York. I'm trying to ascertain, based on the goal that you have here about creating a more, which I think is a fantastic goal, to create a more balanced assessment system, are we, parents, going to see additional type of assessment weeded, breathed in there, other than just the standard exit ticket from the Engage New York curriculum or the worksheets that I see from the Engage New York curriculum, which I happen to like, again, but based on your goal, based on the evidence, I'm confused about how am I going to know what kids, how they're progressing, right? I see a lot of stuff that talks to what adults are doing and what adults are going to be able to do, which is great, because like you said, we got to make it in stages and we got to get there. But in something like balanced assessment.
So I guess I'll give another example, and if I'm not successful this time, though, I'm going to turn it over, because I'm not sure if I'm not understanding your question. I'm not sure, so let me try another one. Math stations. So we've started to change some of our instructional practices in many classrooms to include math stations. Part of math stations is it gives us a chance to assess students through other ways than we normally would. So again, I just want to clarify what we mean by a balanced assessment system. All that means is that we are assessing students in multiple ways. So you may see the same assessment if you have a child in 4th grade. That assessment may not change. It may be that the teacher changed the way that she's providing the instruction. So I guess that's the part I just want to make sure that I'm clear on. No one is saying that every assessment is going to change.
Well, can we take it back? I mean, but I think, here we're talking, goes back to my question. Here we're talking about programmatically that when you try and assess, you're looking for different types of learning to assess the knowledge, the skill, making the skill, making meaning and transfer. And you're asking, will we see that reflected in the classroom?
Yeah, and I think you said yes.
Well, I'm saying that I would have thought, and again, I'll use math stations. For me, that is something that we've started a couple of years ago. It's grown. It's now in more classrooms. So I think I'm answering your question. If not, though, ask me again, or.
And if I could kind of supplement, I think there were other examples of where there's new initiatives. So I immediately am drawn to thinking about the high school and that idea of introducing a new component of student reflection associated with their learning experience. And so in doing so, there's a new mechanism that would be put in place. So we also then start, and I don't want us to get hung up just on thinking about mathematics, because we're saying that, but it's a fair example. So when we're talking about math, we can say, well, so we're going through and there's a data review and teachers. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to change the assessment as a result of the experience. The idea is that we're working back the other way. That we believe in the assessment, that if we think it's a good assessment that's measuring what the stage 1, the objectives, well, then we're taking that data and working backwards to say, what do we have to do different with our instruction? What do we have to do different in our planning to be able to enhance student progress on that front? So looking at that in that area, well, now the idea becomes, and as Raina referenced before, the work where we started the year with our instructional leaders is taking one little model like that exists and beginning to translate that model into other areas. So there's pieces where we're looking at grade level leaders, where we're looking at department leaders, being able to pick a data set and not necessarily saying using the math model, but devising a model that is going to create that assessment and feedback loop to evaluate the effectiveness of what is happening. And so there's a piece to it that I'm hearing that we're saying there's like a philosophical piece in and around use of data and what assessment begins to look like. And I got to say, a piece of this kind of excites me because this is spurring the conversation that's good for us to have. So when we look at where we're headed coming, next month in our work session, we're going to have a workshop experience where we're talking about what rigor looks like in classrooms, right? And what the challenging learning can be, but what does rigor mean? It just doesn't mean hard. It just doesn't mean more work. What is rigor, right? How are we stretching kids' thinking and having them think in new ways? So then we follow that up with a discussion in and around assessment. And that has that potential of becoming not only a conversation about what we do here in Irvington, where we're going with our data work in this objective, but it gives us to have that conversation about philosophically what we believe and what we want assessment to be in our schools. And I think it's a very challenging balance to have at times, because, you know, we step back and we look at that, we have 15% of our families have opted their children out of the state assessments. And as a result of that, you know, our data set's affected. There's some gaps in what we have to analyze. And we also look at other little things that are inconsequential, but like we had schools that didn't get acknowledged as reward schools because we didn't have the required participation levels. So we have to step back and think, well, where's that balance in developing meaningful assessment that's going to inform the internal piece, satisfy some of the external piece, but not put us in a position where we're just putting in more testing just for the sake of producing some kind of number or report.
That's not what I was asking at all. You did answer my question, and I'm excited about it, and I just want to follow it up with the second piece, and it's connected to, I think, you talked a lot about unit planners. I know what you're talking about. I don't know if anybody else in the community knows what that means when you speak about unit planners and so forth. But I know that you created and did an awesome presentation last year about publicizing the units of study across the different grades. I would like to recommend, I guess on behalf of us, but I don't talk about it, is maybe you could, you know, revisit that with folks so that they understand what the unit planners are, and then they can visualize what you just described really beautifully.
Yeah, we certainly can go and reflect on that. And as a point of reference for public, and we can move on, is that that when we think about our curriculum being online, and Raina referenced earlier, there's links on the website to Rubicon Atlas, and when you follow that, it'll introduce you to learning objectives and the curriculum across the district.
Yeah, and to your point, if community members want to learn about that process, which has been pretty much a core initiative here, there is a discussion from, I think, last.
Core with a C or a K.
I was just going to say, I'm not sure which core you were referring to just now.
Trademark it? There we go. But it's a great discussion, and then on top of it, in terms of with your own students, you can go online and see their units of instruction and what's coming up ahead. So it's a very
but don't go in thinking you're going to find the assessments. They're
yes,
not there.
that piece is known. All right, so let's move on to the district goals. Are there any questions related to those that anyone would like to ask about? I really like the framework in terms of with the B&G and the forecasting for.
Yeah, I just want to reinforce the point that similar frameworks look across the board. And when we think about that work and the illustration there, to Catherine's point, it highlights the linkage to the strategic objectives. And we have that for all the plans that have been created by all the administrators that we've heard from tonight, and Artie, who, you know, I stood in for. But the thought here is that there's a piece to it that I really put that out there as a model. And as Raina said, we'll build the framework to provide the information in a more clear and concise way. And I think some of that will speak to some of maybe even the questions that Dave brought up before. But there's a chunk to that I include there that is like the technical side of it. So when we think about where that is, those are the nuance, the technical steps that the educators are taking. So when I use those as a model, but when we think about expanding and including other objectives in this work, that there'll be some gaps there because it's very technical in its delivery. But there's going to be that opportunity for us to expand on that.
Okay. Any questions related to the K through 5 portion of the presentation?
So, yes, I have one.
So Deb and Joyce, you want to come up to the mic? K through 5, yeah, Dazzling and Main Street. All right, who's up?
You go first.
Okay, all right, so I'm speaking, I'm the voice for some parents who were too shy to be here. And the couple of questions that have come up via email to us just recently, one was with regard to, do we have any gifted programs at the K through 5 where, you know, students who had some extra abilities could perhaps be given other opportunities for more advanced learning. So that was the first question.
I think we speak to what Raina has presented before, which is that there's
Yeah,
articulated
yeah,
instruction. Articulated instruction
Yeah.
is essentially the answer.
So a little bit of a curveball, I guess, and just, so that idea to say that when we think about enrichment, when we think about where we go with challenging and stretching every student, it comes through unit design. It comes from tiered levels of instruction with differentiated instruction, where our teachers are becoming equipped to be able to challenge every kid and support every kid's needs in each and every classroom. That idea of looking at our curriculum being well-articulated K-12, it provides that structure and system for teachers to be able to have that target and where to extend instruction on a regular basis. So there's opportunities that are embedded. And of course, when we get to secondary levels, there's plenty of opportunities for kids to explore different pathways. I don't know if Joyce and Deb want to expand on that, but I think
I think the parent was asking about more than that, though, not just within the classroom. I think they were actually looking at opportunities to pull them out and give them something additional, maybe.
So
this-
Right, that's a
So
pull,
that's
it's a pull-out
something-
model.
It's a pullout, so I'll just answer. That's a pullout model. It's certainly a model that we had several years ago now, actually, 4 or 5 years ago. It's not a model that we currently have. I think as Chris said, we believe that good instruction should be happening across in the classroom. And certainly in mathematics, Christine Rosner does support classroom teachers who might have a student who would benefit from some additional expanded work within the context of the curriculum, and she certainly does support that. But no, we don't have enrichment outside of the classroom.
So that was what
Yeah,
the.
no pull-out.
So the second question actually is broader than just K through 5, but we got an email from Beth Proper today talking about her support for Spanish early in the K through 5 levels. And I know we've heard this repeatedly. It was actually a very well-articulated email talking about if we're going to go for any language, it probably shouldn't be Mandarin, it should be Spanish at an early age. And then she was also asking if we could test for placement in middle school so that maybe students who have a more advanced knowledge of, say, Spanish or French might be able to go into higher levels.
So then you
And the third thing was with regard to Latin, was actually starting Latin earlier in middle school. So it was a broad thing, and I know it's come up many times.
And I see lots of smiles in the audience. We're not going to hide behind that. I think we look at this through a couple different lenses, and I just want to name them so I really don't forget them. So we look at thinking strategically, right? So and where we're going, and then I think we think about capacity. And when I look to folks in the audience and some of the folks that we've spoken with along the way, we think about where capacity is to be able to do some work. And then I want to speak to some history. And so we've developed strategic objectives. We're going to be looking to see an update on our strategic plan before the end of this calendar year. And there'll be some process and some thinking that goes into that and where we are. But the reality behind the challenges that we have, I think, are reflected, and I'll flip my order, reflected maybe in some of the history. That we did have a program that was experiential, dipping our toe in the water of world language that existed at a lower grade, and the program was reduced. We revisited this topic, and I'm trying to think, Raina, it was a year and a half ago now, maybe? And we had some thorough conversation, presentation that Raina gave, and looking at the exploration of program, the variety of different models. And I think it was with the support of the board, there was agreement that we weren't in a position to be able to look to progress and move a program forward at that time. So there's certainly interest, and I got to tell you that we had in that same, I think 2 years ago, discussion about looking at a program that we're looking to expand down to 5th grade. We've done a lot of work in our world language program, and I think those folks who have had kids that have gone through our secondary experiences can speak to improvements in the program, shifts in instruction. a real focus on our students being able to speak the language, and another area that connects with our data goals and being able to evaluate that work on that end with assessments that are being administered internally in and around language. So I don't think anyone steps back and says that we don't think there's value to it. We don't think that that if we could find the opportunity that we wouldn't want to provide it for our kids. It's stepping back and thinking about where we are and the capacity that we have to be able to implement such a program. And so when we say capacity, it's that idea of building a program, scheduling a program, looking at the options that are on the table and how you fit it into a school day, and to doing so with some fidelity. So, I'm, to the email that you referenced, that's, certainly we're not in a place to say that, yes, with language next year, we're looking strategically and long range, but when that opportunity comes, I think that's when the discussion comes about what the language would be. We're not in a place where we're able to recommend, because I can tell you without confidence that we're not in a position where we can be able to support the implementation of an elementary world language program today or tomorrow, let alone be able to say which language it would be and where the languages would grow to be.
And I know we've had these conversations a number of times. What about the second part of her question, which was testing for proficiency in middle school and giving kids, do we do that, or?
So we're actually really excited. So, this interest in building our students' capacity around language, we know at the elementary level, when implemented thoroughly and cohesively and comprehensively, we know what the research says. There's no question about it. But we also know what it says when you can implement that way. Having said that, over these last few years, I, along with our secondary administrators and our language teachers, have become very, very committed to really engaging our students in a way that every student who stays with a language, I'm not talking about a student who only does language for 2 years, but we have a lot of students who stay with the language for a lot of years and take a second language. Certainly we have plenty of students who take Latin, but we also have dual language French and Spanish. And I would say two things that we're looking to do. One is, is Dave Cohn's back there, and Matt. So one thing that we're looking to do is find ways to offer French 1, so that students can really engage in a second sequence easily. Right now what happens is if you have a child who doesn't take Spanish, who comes to our schools later, and they've missed the opportunity to take a language in middle school, they've been sort of guided into Spanish without French being an option. In addition, we have students who would like to take a French sequence, as well as a Spanish sequence. So we have expanded the opportunities. I think thanks to the board's support, we had a part-time teacher who we were able to make full-time, and then a second teacher full-time. So we're incredibly committed to making sure that our language program is there and supports lots of different entries for students who have this interest. In addition, we're committed to our students leaving speaking a language if they are going to stay, if they do stay with that language for 3, 4, 5 years. So starting 2 years ago, we dipped our toe in assessing our 8th graders and 10th graders. Last year, we assessed our 8th graders and 10th graders again on speaking and listening. And now, this coming year, we're going to assess at every level, and that's what we're assessing for. We're assessing for proficiency. We're really looking to ensure that students who are moving more quickly, for whatever reason, sometimes it's just they have an aptitude for language, sometimes they have family members at home who speak a language. We want to make sure that if a student is ready to go further, we're providing that opportunity, and we want to make sure that our students who are staying with the language leave here speaking. The shift in how we teach language is significant. As we all know, those of us who learned to speak, we didn't speak at 1 year. At a year old, nobody was giving us a pen and asking us to write a full sentence. What we were asked to do was we listened, right? We listened to the adults around us and the kids around us, and we started to speak, and we made mistakes, and little by little, we acquired language. Well, the approach in schools has not really been the acquisition of language the way we naturally acquire language, thank you, the way that we naturally acquire language. So our whole shift is on language acquisition, and therefore We are focusing on speaking and listening. We did not eliminate grammar or reading and writing. It's not that, but we have changed the focus, and we're assessing for that focus. And again, as I said, this year we'll assess at every level. And it's all about proficiency. So as much as I know that you're disappointed to hear me say the part about the elementary, I do hope that you appreciate the shifts and practices that we're making at the secondary level, because they're significant.
Thanks.
Sorry about that.
Dowsley?
Trying to refocus the question
Back-
back to the presentation, although I will connect it with that question because it's a great question, and I know you're all here smiling, like you said. Interesting thing about that letter also, really I think should be noted, is that quote, the community would be willing to have an increase in taxes. I don't think we mentioned that, just for the record. But that's an important point, though, because when a school board represents the community in regards to allocating funding, it ties us right back to goals. And how do we know that a program that we've invested in is working? And should we continue to invest, or can we reinvest somewhere else, et cetera, right? So with that, I had a quick question. I loved that, and this is really for all the schools, I guess, at the end of the day. But since you're first, I'll just ask it, and then let's see what happens. Again, I noticed, first I'll make a notice, and then I'll do my wondering. So I noticed again that all the evidence is essentially, except for one or two bullet points, for the most part, is targeted towards understanding how well adults are doing, as opposed to, and again, I know, Chris, Dr. Harrison, that we talked about, stages and, dipping the toe and moving forward, but I just, I wonder why at each school level there aren't sub-goals that are a little simpler for the public to understand and consume. And I think at the elementary school, which is why I'm asking it now, is that you have such a unique opportunity, because in the work that Raina was discussing that we're moving forward with, you're already there with the Ames Web piece, which is a real strong data point. And I wondered why you don't have a sub-goal that speaks to identifying students who are making progress based on the measure that you're using, so that we can say, well, we invested in this program as a district, and it's working, right? We see that it's working, right? You use the fountain, and along with other data points like running records, student conferences, the little quizzes, et cetera, where we can say, wow, okay, you're really moving forward. So I just wondered about that.
So, and I'll jump in here, and there's a piece to it that comes back to as you acknowledge, Dave, that there's a growth model, and looking at, so we have data sets that we're just starting to use. So the intent of these data sets is to help kids initially, and your ask is stepping back a little forward and coming to that area of what Raina referenced before, program evaluation. So we're looking at programs that you're a year into, 2 years into, and so now it's starting to try to find those opportunities, one of how do we use this in that broader sense. So that's a part of what this year is about and the broader data goal is about. But then I also want to shift to, again, when we have those conversations throughout the year, thinking philosophically about what do we want to measure. And we want opportunities to exist that are going to give us feedback about programs. So here we have, you mentioned Ames Web as one particular tool. We have the language assessment, the Apple, that is being implemented. So we're just starting to implement these with Fidelity. So now you're starting to develop data sets. Now is the conversation about how you use them and what do we believe the purpose of that use is. And again, that becomes a philosophical piece. So there's an aspect of it. I totally hear what you're saying about wanting to be able to have us report out on things from a progress and maybe an accountability lens. But then there's a piece to it about how we're building the capacity around what we're using and some of the intent of why we implemented some of these tools. So there's growth to this particular process. I think when we talk about backing out and looking at some simplistic goals and some outcomes, there's some that I agree are clearer cut than others, and we will look to try to clarify that in a way that's more clear and concise.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think maybe the community should realize that a document like this is a living document, and it lives and breathes and changes. And I would certainly advocate for something like that, just because, just to push back a little bit, right, constructively, that I think that, you can do the program I watched it with my own kid. I watched my own first grader last year. I watched the whole arc of it. As an educator, I can watch where the real scrutiny is high. And I watched it work, and I watched the growth. And I think the community at large would really benefit from that, maybe taking the risk and saying, a simple, measurable goal where, 75% of students at Dow's Lane will be reading at a level X by the time, or whatever, right?
So there's a piece to it, and I think your point is being heard, and I think there's a point to it of understanding the data before you can be able to predict what growth looks like and be able to set those kinds of objectives. So, and that's a part of our journey, is understanding the data that we have, understanding the different ways in which we can use it, and then selecting the opportunities for which we want to apply it. And that's a part of our process this year, lots of learning, and I think we, out of the gate, Raina referenced that this is the year for that.
I'm excited.
Any, go
Yeah,
ahead.
my question actually goes for all of the schools, but we could start with Dow's Lane. And look, and
I saw
sorry.
you try to run.
You talked through all of the schools reporting about balanced assessments a balanced assessment system in all of the schools. You talked about using the data and how to reflect and build and develop the teacher going forward and building the program going forward. And you guys cited all different examples, math stations, exit tickets, and closing activities. And then Matt, when you presented, you talked about there's going to be a shift in the high school students then looking at like their exam and seeing, analyzing that and saying, okay, now where do I go from here? But what I haven't heard, and I'm very sick, so forgive me, but I didn't hear anywhere, is where is the piece of, or what are you doing? Are you using this assessment and this data to then go back to the existing class to say, they're not getting this, let's circle back? Like, I'm not hearing a reflection within the current, the current teacher teaching a specific class or specific classes. I'm not hearing the reflection within the year, just going forward or building the program, but not current year, current students. I guess that, I
So when
didn't.
you say reflection, can I ask a clarifying question? So Matt's example for the high school that he and Dave are working on is specific to student reflection.
Right.
So when you're saying reflection, are we talking student reflection? Because I think back to a video of an elementary student last year of a student reflecting about her
No, I'm
skills.
talking about
but-
using various data, using, however, math stations, closing activities at the high school, whatever, practices you have in each of your schools, using that to then possibly identify and reflect on what's being taught now, like a concrete, math, ninth grade is algebra. So your assessments, I don't know, is it a closing activity, whatever you do, taking that, and you're saying that the teacher can then use that going forward, how they could change the curriculum going forward, but what about the current curriculum? Like, are you analyzing to see the kids are getting this particular
That's formative
concept?
assessment. So again, when Dave said, before when you were saying, and we talk a balanced assessment system, what we're talking about is different opportunities to measure what kids know. So formative assessment is being done in our classrooms all the time. It's formative assessment that tends to inform the next day. It tends to inform the next week. But why don't I let Joyce or Deb give an example from the buildings?
Well, I would say that the greatest quote I've ever heard from Shelley Harway is that every moment in a classroom is ripe for assessment. So I could take an example of a student who's doing a writing in their narrative piece right now. We're working in our narrative unit. Every grade level K-5 is in their narrative unit. So when teachers are conferencing with students and taking a look either at an individual student's piece of work and they're digging into the qualities of student writing and giving specific feedback to that child, but the other piece of it that we shared with interactions and how they work with each other and they socialize. Each one of those moments of giving our teachers information should inform, has to be informing of their practice for what they'll teach the next day, what small group. On the other side of it, more to the other side of the question is noticing students that are ready for more. Students that we're assessing them on a daily basis, saying they don't need to repeat this lesson. We're going to take this group of students based on a pattern in our classroom, and we're going to create a small group mini lesson to push them forward while we know that there are other students in the class that may need a tier 1 intervention or a tier 2 or reteaching in order to get them in par with the rest of their classmates. So I hope that, I think that answers the question in that it's twofold. The daily informing that we do, every piece of what we do is right for assessment to inform our practice. And then there's the larger overarching view that we're taking where it's informing our program. It's informing our curriculum maps and where we're taking students long term. It speaks to what David asked about with ultimately what types of experiences we're going to build for students on long term. But that's not going to stop us from doing the daily work day to day.
Can I follow up too? I'd like to take those comments and that thinking and shift to the high school if we can, because it's a different experience and a different form of assessment. So if I could ask Dave a
You guys
question.
from the mic.
When we hear these presentations, we talk in terms of student thinking, and we don't use the word student achievement. I'm sure that it's intentional. But at the high school, when we look at a balanced assessment and trying to measure student thinking, I think of it differently because our students are taking courses in specific subjects. In some cases, it's an AP course in bio, and then they take an AP exam, or they take an SAT too. Examples like that. And I'm curious what we should expect from the high school going forward when we look at how you are going to look at those results and how it informs your thinking on how we're doing. Because really the purpose of data, in many ways, at least from the Board of Ed's perspective, is its ability to point out how we're doing, how are our children achieving, and is the program being taught in a manner that makes them feel successful and that we measure student achievement. So could you just speak to that a little bit? Because to me it's there's different data points, and I'm curious how you're going to use them.
And I think we've talked about this a little bit in years past, because, I realize you're using AP Bio or any AP classes as an example. But I think, data is in the performance, but data is also in the enrollment. So, we've prided ourselves on an open enrollment process into our AP courses. So, and I think it's both, Deb. So I think there's an opportunity for us to be looking at that. Marina talked about work with all of our instructional leaders around setting targets around different types of data that we're looking at. And that's a K-12 model. That's not just at the high school, but within that then is the work that Matt and I will be able to do with each of the chairs around, what kinds of data they're looking at. And, we're interested in some of our own. So ultimately the answer is yes, but it may look different in different departments. So in one department they may want to specifically look at AP data, in another maybe Regents data, in another could be others. So, I think we're at the front end of formalizing a process. Similar to your question before, David, it's a process forward for us to be able to both use data and understand what kind of data we want to be looking at, and B, to make sure that it is creating an effective balanced assessment process for us. So, I know there was a question where it felt like it was really teacher-centric, but the whole point is to be able to make those distinctions so that when we are analyzing data and making further decisions, it's meaningful to us. And, I guess, Maria, to speak to your point also, it's never just about trying to figure out how to modify curriculum for the future. All of those ways that we want to look at data is ultimately to support current students, but also to improve over time so that we're growing through that process collectively. So let me just bring it back, Deb, and ultimately say, certainly we want to be looking at AP data, but right now we haven't necessarily targeted a full-fledged AP analysis for this year as the goal.
So if there were any other K through 5 questions, because we have them up, I think we'll stick with high school questions for the moment. We could potentially circle back.
And I just want to be mindful of that. I know there's some members of the administrative team that have, like babysitting that's going to expire in the very near future. They need to move. So I just want to be mindful that some people are going to need to start to slip out shortly.
I have a question for the high school and the middle school, I guess, because Project Lead the Way and the 5th grade, I can't escape all of them because they're all connected beautifully. I'd be curious, again, I wonder, this is now the 3rd year of PLTW, yeah? Right, 3rd year?
Third year growth model. I mean, we had, you know, at the high school, we had a singular PLTW class for many years. But yes, it's the 3rd year.
But of it really being a
Sequence.
Right, a sequence. You know, I'd be curious, and you probably don't have the answers, so it's more of a forward question, but I'd be curious to see, like, so we've invested in this program, it's 3 years down the road of sequenced. What's the impact of that program on any other number of subject areas, on any other number of, colleges kids go to, or et cetera? I just would really be curious sometime down the road.
Some of it may speak exactly to what Deb's question also in terms of the purity around, you know, the PLTW classes, can culminate with the students taking an exam that potentially leads to college credit and things like that. So, you know, there's certainly data there that we can present about.
And along the lines of 21st century learners and PLTW, are we planning to expand technology or specifically computer science offerings?
I mean, we've been talking about that for a number of years. I think, you know, we've made a lot of growth in terms of adding more courses and sequences at the high school. You know, I can remember standing here 4 years ago and talking about that as one of my entry points when I first became principal here at the high school, that I felt like we had a lot of great courses, but they felt like singular experiences that students were having, and it was certainly a goal of ours to start creating broader sequences so students could specialize at the same time that they could have a really broad depth of curriculum. We're constantly looking to do more of that, but I think at some point in time we also have to put that up against, you know, how we're pulling students in multiple directions, and, you know, how many different sequences are we truly building out? At what point in time does it take away from some of our focus? So ultimately, the answer to that is yes, Catherine. But, you know, I think it's through further analysis and figuring exactly what the growth is. So I'm not in a position to be able to say we've targeted these types of classes this year to automatically increment next year, but every year we've looked at ways that we can advance sequences.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to a goal that actually one of Jesse's objectives is working with buildings, developing the recommendations for how we continue, whether it's our STEM sequence, our computer programming sequence, you know, and in those areas we've added, you know, from computer programming 1 to computer programming 2 to an AP computer programming, to bringing computer programming 1 down to an opportunity in 8th grade at one point. So there has been areas of growth in that area. So, but it's an area of evaluating where the capacity is, where the interest may lie, to be able to expand those opportunities. So I think that's a good example of how when we think of the goals for the technology and innovation, how it's not a singular department. It's not that idea that Jesse's over here working in this zone, and then, you know, David and Allison are here, and so on and so forth. Jesse's work and Kimberly and Gail's work, it's woven through everything that's happening in the school. So here's a piece of work that Jesse's leading, but it's impacting every school, or Jesse's partnering with the other administrators, and there's going to be recommendations that will grow out of that. So it's an area where it may not be an exact number to say so many students of this, so many students of that, but that opportunity and recommendations for growth, but based upon some logic, potentially some data.
Other questions for high school? Can you give us a short plug about one of your major initiatives, which is the master schedule? Where should, not
Sure.
here, but where they go to?
Maybe
Don't explain it.
Maybe another board
Don't
meeting.
explain it. Don't explain it. Just
Dave,
tell us. Just tell us.
Where do we get it?
Where do we get it?
Great. So we hosted a parent information session about 2 weeks ago, and
pushed out through district communication this week as well.
Okay, great. I guess we'll move to the middle school. There's circular route here. It's not often you last up.
No, it's not.
We saved the best for last.
Sorry,
I
yeah.
think so, but I couldn't say that publicly.
But you just did.
Yeah.
It's on tape.
Let's see what's air on his tires when he goes home tonight.
So, does anybody want to jump in?
Oh, that's the hook.
No, that's here. That's,
Sometimes it's good being.
I'll start it
Oh,
just
I thought
because
you were
I just want to
going.
reiterate.
No.
No.
I'm sorry. You want to go?
No, I was curious, I'm sorry, I thought Catherine was going. When you talk about the new elective, the PLTW, green architecture, I look back to the strategic goal, and I looked at last year, and, we understand that there's a process to identify, select, and implement new courses and programs. And I was just curious how this one came to be, and what's next on the horizon, and how you go about identifying what the middle school needs, based on what you're offering, or what your own goals are.
So there's a couple of things I think that came to be, the journey of our PLTW program goes back 2 years to when we implemented the design and modeling course, which became our 7th grade technology program, followed last year by the automation and robotics course in the 8th grade. So these are the foundation courses for the PLTW Gateway program, which really they kind of denote as the required courses if you're going to run Gateway, and then you kind of go from there and you can add any one or more of these kind of explorations into different areas. So there were a couple of things that kind of came into our thinking as we began to say, all right, so now we have this opportunity to add this additional course kind of on an elective basis for 8th graders. One of the things we considered was what type of a course can we offer that will then have at least some opportunity for students to follow up on that, based, when they go into high school. So the knowledge that we have, the architectural design in the high school is is a nice follow-up for students who can get invested in that process or interested in that process, can kind of explore it as 8th graders, and then have the option to move on from there. So that's one factor, I think, that went into it. The other factor, quite frankly, is facility. Kind of looking at what we could offer within the facility that we have, and knowing what kind of training was going to be required for teachers. So there's a training component for any one of these courses that you want to add to your program. So that influences us, a little bit. Obviously, the bigger picture is what students will be doing in the course and what they can do after the course. We've actually just begun talking about what can follow from this. I think we're in the early discussion phases of that, and a little bit of it is, would we want to continue to look at things that there's a follow-up opportunity for, or is there a time where we want to say, hey, we want to just have this opportunity for 8th graders to explore something new, and then that would then lead to later decisions about whether there should be something else to offer beyond that. So that's, there's a little bit of that thinking happening right now, but we're not in a position to say where we want to go next in terms of specific course offering. I think we know that we want to add to our course offerings. We want to continue to build out this idea of an 8th grade elective program. I also talked a little bit about that earlier. We want students to have some choice and some voice. We really are looking at, as we get into the second half of this year, taking a really new approach to how the course selection process works for our 8th grade students, as they have a lot of these choices. Some of them are acceleration choices. Some of them, however, are going to be choices that are simply middle school choices, but we want them to be really enriching and really meaningful course offerings. So that's a little bit of our process there, and a little bit of where we're going with that. What courses it will be, that's still kind of in the drawing board stage right now.
Okay, and what's the enrollment like this year for that green architecture?
So we have 2 sessions, both are pretty, we look at it as a pilot session. We have about, I want to say 8 to 10 each of those sections. And it was one of those things where, as kind of a late breaking pilot, it really became available after the budget process, which means well after most of the scheduling process was done. We've gotten really positive feedback on how
Is it a full year or is it a half
It's
year?
a half-year course.
Five-week wheel.
It's an every other day course. It basically works out to be like a 10-week course because it's every other day for half the year.
Can I?
Will there be a second session of it in the?
That's right, yes, exactly.
So can I piggyback off that and then ask a separate question? One, you said it was new and it happened late. How did kids get assigned to that class?
So what happened was over the summer, or as we got into the scheduling process, the last phase of the scheduling process, I reached out to our entire 8th grade and said, so this is an opportunity that exists. And here are the students that we're looking to schedule into it kind of automatically, but also you can reach out and put yourself involved as well. And that's exactly what happened. So we had a nice growth of kids, even coming into the first week of school saying, you know what, I was away over the summer, I wasn't really sure about this program, but I want to get in, and so we've had kids sign up even late for it. So nice to watch this.
Awesome. So now my question, so it slings back to data, and if I'm walking in as a parent to 6th grade for the first time, which I happen to be, but the question is general. The data I have on my kid, what I know about my child, is that he's out of 5th grade. He did well. I met with the teachers. We talked. I got the story. I know what he's strong in, what he's weak in. Now he's coming into, I get over the summer, in August, I get the state exam scores, which I think have a great deal of value. And I see my child was a 4 in 4th grade. He's now a 3 in ELA in the 5th grade, steady 4 in mathematics. When I come to meet with the teachers, how are the teachers taking that information, that one data point, understanding, again, I know just to make sure we're clear, it's one data point of many. How are they taking that one data point that's the only thing that I have as a parent, right? And, in math, I know he was a 4 in 4th grade, so.
You're speaking
well.
generically.
Huh?
You're speaking generically.
Yeah, well, I mean, just because the question, it could be for any kid, right? How is that data used to make decisions, right? And then further, how as a parent, if my child went from a 4 to a 3, how do I know what's being attended to in the classroom based on what he fell back on, right? So I find out on the back of the report that he's stayed strong here, but he fell back in writing. When I come to see his ELA teacher, will the ELA teacher be able to talk about that, why maybe he fell back in writing based on what she or he has observed, based on the writing, and what the plan is to improve the writing to get them back to a different place, and math, vice versa.
And you preface this by saying it's a single measure, too, right?
I
So-
just want to make
so
sure
just
that,
wanna
I
say-
know there are multiple measures, so that's why I'm asking, because there are, we're only 5 weeks in, right? So when any family has a kid 5 weeks in, there aren't that many points, so I want to know what the plan is, right, as a parent for my child.
So I'll try to answer your first question first, which was how does the data that we have get used to make decisions about your child? And so, to me, that really speaks quite specifically to our placement process for mathematics. And again, that goes well beyond state data. We actually use multiple data points. That's one of the, we talk about data sets and the uses of data in our district that's well established and that have been kind of refined over time. I would say our 5 to 6 math placement process, which has now been in place for, I don't know, 10, 11 years.
Oh, at least,
At least, right?
probably, yeah, 12, I would say.
So, that is one of the most well-refined and well-developed that we have. So that's one place that we're using data that comes from state assessment, but it also comes from locally developed assessments, comes from teacher assessment, and a host of different points, to make decisions about whether a student gets placed into our 6th grade math or our accelerated course. It also informs our decisions about whether or not a student is going to begin the year in an AIS program as a 6th grader. So that's one way that a decision would get made about a child. Another thing that's new for us is this incoming 6th grade is the first grade that we have this data set through AimsWeb. So that's a new experience for us, and we're getting at the middle school kind of our It's, yeah, right, and I say right, don't bring this out. But it is literally a very basic list of scores, performance levels, for the ELA and math assessments, but all, for their students from last year, as well as their incoming students. It's our benchmark analysis, both prior and current year, and then it's an item analysis. So they actually have for each student about 3 to 4 pages per assessment of actual standards broken down by numbers of question, types of question, and how students did on it. Now, if you were to meet with a teacher right now and say, tell me all about this, will they have poured over every item analysis at this point? I will say absolutely not. And if they have, I'd like to know what's keeping them up at night. And that's because it's a lot of data, right? But in those initial rounds of meeting with and working with kids and getting to know who they are teachers looking at that data? Is it helping to fill out a picture that might begin to form in their minds in their initial work with students? Absolutely. The other thing that they have, and again, this forms part of our team meeting process. One of the things that's critical for us is our meeting time that we set aside every day for our different grade levels. One use of which is a meeting with guidance counselors to talk about students. Is some of the data that Main Street School sends to us, just in terms of information on individual students. It talks a little bit about performance levels and achievement data, but it also talks a little bit about who a student is, how a student learns best, things that could potentially cause struggle or could be ways to get past struggle. So we can, I would say we have some data, we've had data over years, and that data has grown over time as different forms of data, and Ainsworth would be an example of that, have kind of come online. So I would expect that if you were to sit down with a teacher, especially given the opportunity for that teacher to sit and look at some of the data that they have, and they begin to say, so here are some things that I pick up on. I don't know if they're going to say they were a 4, now they're a 3, and here's how I'm going to get them back to a 4. They probably talk in a little bit more granular fashion, but I see that these are some standards, these are some areas where he or she struggled on a particular assessment. I'm going to be looking at that as we get into this unit of study or that unit of study, and so forth.
Great. Thank you very much. And this is a conversation that we're going to continue over the course of the fall.
I was just going to say, like, with that was a great answer, because to lean to what Chris said, Dr. Harrison said at the beginning, we're ready to do this work now.
That's right.
So thanks.
I think we're going to move on to departments just to keep things rolling. And any questions related to PPS?
Oh.
By the way, it was great to see you up there in your first presentation together, so thank you for that. These stands are not working out for you. And just not a question, but just a reflection. I'm very excited to see that the alignment that you're with your goals to what the schools are doing in terms of their unit planners, and also with your service providers. So I think that's great. Anyone? Laura? Go. I think you got. I think you have an opportunity here.
Jump on it.
Great. So clearly the focus on the quality of instruction that you referred to, can you hear me? Okay, was very encouraging. It's always encouraging to hear that. And as far as the criteria for increased participation of service providers and consultants, I wondered if you could talk about how you kind of build that, or if there's already a practice in place for how you decide.
Are you talking about students that are classified or not classified, or both?
Well, it wasn't specified in the, so if you have 2 pieces of the answer, then 2 pieces would be
So
great.
obviously, for students that are classified, we have annual reviews and talk through the needs of services and talk through their goals and then what that level of service would look like, whether we're talking speech 2 or 3 times a week. That is one component. When we talk about students that are not classified, as we talked about, we have an RTI framework that we have, as related service providers, have worked
talked about that as a goal. So is there any change in the way that those decisions are made versus?
Correct, because we're obviously looking at more data points and looking to increase our toolkit of what we're using for assessment data, so that will always be ongoing work. So we will then incorporate that into our framework in terms of what constitutes a level of service for articulation versus language, receptive versus expressive.
Gail, if I may interject, I think like the theme that I read through in your evidence is the standardization of practice, right? So, in looking at, so whether it's this slide or the other, there's a consistent theme at looking at setting expectations and then implementing, understanding that there's limitations at different levels because of staffing, school schedule, and there's only so many people to go around. But it's that idea of identifying what we believe to be the best practices, collaborating with the school teams, and then implementing that. So there clearly be a report back to be able to identify what the shifts have been in these areas.
Well, and I think one of the things, I mean, this is my first year, so from our assessments and what we learned, I think one of the big changes is the front loading of the planning with our service providers, as opposed to them just being kind of on the side. And not that they've always been on the side, but really a focus of them having that time with teachers as well. We're working closely with the building administrators to help them be a part of grade level meetings and really be a part of that planning process based on their services and their data that they have on their students. So I'd say that's probably one of the big changes as well.
And that's the way you're getting information, right? Through that collaboration, we're hearing what those needs are, and then you further assess when something is brought to someone's attention where they're just not understanding where something may be. So through those conversations and that collaboration, that's where you're gonna see that increase of assessment and the different assessment that will come with it, and then for determination of a level of service.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions related to PPS?
No, just one, just to be clear. So when we look at the goal for your department to implement instructional practices that elevate student thinking, that's referring to the students that we have in district. Is that correct? So you're not referring to any changes or any new direction for those students that are out of district?
Not at this time.
Right.
As it pertains to this objective.
That's separate, but there's always work that we are doing as a department as we move forward, but not reflected in this at this moment.
And likewise then for developing a balanced assessment system, again, we're talking about assessment for students that are in district.
Correct.
I have one question, it's a very short question. Do you work with all service providers, including teachers, of students with IEPs on understanding and building really high-quality goals on those IEPs and what that PD looks like for them, or what it,
Yes, that's obviously always in the forefront of our work, but I think one of our focuses this year, and Kimberly touched upon it, is case management, and where that IEP writing will sit in our work this year, in partnership, obviously, with teachers, building admins, and our related service providers, to really increase that work. I think it's always been there, but I think we want to look at it differently, start building it with some of our other assessment pieces, and to what Kimberly referenced before, that case management will be central to that work, as well as all our assessment tools.
I think we're going to move on to our new director of technology, if he's available.
This is perfect timing too, because I peak at 10:30, so
Yes.
we're on schedule. We're on schedule.
Get 10. It's a half hour. So do we.
We're getting a second wind. Hang on.
Oh, boy.
Mr. Friedman, any?
Jesse, you talked during the presentation about the international standards. Could you just tell me a little bit more about those, and is that something we try to follow here? And if so, how does it fit within the overall goal development?
Sure, so we're currently in the final year of a 4-year plan that we developed a few years ago, a technology plan. And that plan was actually based around those ISTE standards. So ISTE releases standards for students and teachers, and actually just recently released a set for coaches. So those are pretty much the most widely used standards. And actually the student ones have just been revised since we actually implemented our plan. So as we move forward with the revision of our plan, we'll continue to go back to those standards. The data we've been collecting over the past
And
Just
there's
give me little example, what are those standards? Are they for use of technology, assessing proficiency with technology? Like,
I mean, yes, is the short answer. I will say if you go and take a look at our technology plan, what you'll see is that we mapped, bless you.
Bless you.
Okay. So, what you would see is our technology plan is actually written down so that you can see observable student and teacher behaviors for each of our goals, with those behaviors being mapped out to each corresponding ISTE standard. So you'd actually be able to get some insight into what types of behaviors exist in the classroom and how that actually maps out to existing international standards.
great, thanks.
So the one thing to note, that there was a presentation on the plan going back that we can find and tag and send that around for board.
An in-depth one, every question answered. So I think we're going to move on from our Board of Ed questions. Thank you very much for some great questions, and we will have ongoing opportunities to speak with our different building leaders over time.
Yeah, sit down. Good.
Is it not a deep dive, I hope?
I'll send you an email.
All right. All right. So we did promise to give community comment, and so what I'd like to just remind those who'd like to speak is that we ask that you share who you are, and we also ask that normally we say 3 minutes. If you can do it even more efficiently, that would be great. We, in fact, have to continue talking about things even after this, so we look forward to hearing what you would like to share. Most of the time, we don't actually respond to the questions, but it's an opportunity for us to hear and take that in. So thank you very much. Who's first?
Hi, everyone. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Erin Bernstein. I'm the parent of a second grader at Dow's Lane. And yes, I was here with last Friday and 20 other parents, but due to babysitting challenges as well, some of them had to leave. But we have strong community support for what I'm about to talk about. Don't have questions, just have comments. And I could talk at about 350 words a minute, so if you can keep up, I can get this done really quick.
Great.
So I was here with a lot of parents to discuss our support and our request to introduce an early foreign language program. That doesn't seem to be news to anybody based on what I've heard. And I think it ties in with the strategic goals. We've talked about creating global citizens. What better way to create global citizens than by having them learn a foreign language? So some of you may know, just for some background, Lorraine Tamarino, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, and Yasina and I started a conversation about the implementation of an early foreign language program. And what we quickly discovered was that we weren't alone. There is tremendous community support for this mission. And throughout this conversation, Lorraine met with Dr. Kaur and Dr. Harrison. I'm sorry, I should have said Dr. Harrison and Dr. Kaur. About
You know what, if we didn't catch anything there.
I was reading right to left. About working together and partnering on this mission. The Irvington district, we have a great district. I don't think there's any denial about that. We have an amazing, amazing school district. I moved here for the schools. I also moved here thinking there would be foreign language in the elementary school, and was very surprised to learn that we didn't have it. So the only problem is it's lacking a fundamental program to really develop global citizens. And I've heard that term thrown around a lot, and it really starts with language and being able to communicate on a global level. I'm sorry, I'm not as prepared as I should be. Important things to note. The program, we've talked about scheduling conflicts. It doesn't actually have to replace anything in the program. We can integrate it into the classroom. I discovered something really interesting. I learned about a school that conducts their morning meeting in a foreign language. They do it in Spanish. So whether it's that particular primary teacher who can do it, or they bring in another teacher who conducts the morning meeting in Spanish. So it doesn't take away from any time, very long time, far before my joining the community for years and years. And so as we learned that there was a really large community support, we've developed a petition to show that support. And we have about 300 households signed our petition, either electronically or in hard form. And we will get that to you. That's 300, that's a lot. And that's just people who are willing to demonstrate public support for this program. Lots of people have told me on the side that they support it, but won't necessarily put pen to paper. Am I talking too long? Okay, sorry.
Enjoying it, actually.
A couple of other notes. We then, community support, we're talking about getting community input. We put out a survey. We had over 200 respondents. 92% said they supported a foreign language. 3/4 of them suggested Spanish as the language. To your point, Dave, that's made in her email, over almost 75% of those respondents said they would be willing to pay an additional 1.5% in property taxes to pay for a program. So that was documented in the survey.
Okay, I think, do you want to hand off the mic, because if there's any repetition, I'm sure they can add to the facts that you're.
I'm going through the survey, so this is me.
I think you can email us a survey. That would be the best way at this time, okay? Would that be all right?
Can I go through just a couple more things at the end? Just a few more comments and things that are new. The Harvard Business Review really recently put together an article that talks about companies that are hiring liberal arts.
It's really okay. If you email us, we will read it. It's okay.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, and I don't think no one's diminishing the point.
Yes.
You're
No, we really embrace it. I mean, I think, in fact, I would have, it would be great if you had sent it beforehand, because we could have reviewed it.
Yeah, unfortunately, being a working mom and doing all this,
Yeah.
time constraints didn't.
No, we're very appreciative.
Okay.
Okay.
Is anybody willing to loan her a minute?
The last
All right.
thing that I wanted to say is that we recognize that it's not an easy undertaking. We get it. We get that it takes time. And we were hoping at least that there could be something on the agenda to look at maybe doing something in the 2019-2020 school year. And at a minimum, and I think there's been conversations about this already, looking at expanding the after-school and before-school programs at Main Street. Parents are willing to pay for this. If you do expand the program, though, just keep in mind transportation. I set my child's after-school goals well in advance of September. So if we find out about the program in September, it can be hard to change, and I can't pick them up from school. So that's it, and I was hoping to be able to say all of it, because it's not really all fully documented here, but.
Did.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks for the time,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
I appreciate you taking the time to listen to us, because we did take the time to sit through and learn about civic education going on this year. My name is Alex Bernetti. I'm a parent of a kindergartner and a second grader, Dallas Lane. And I'm also here to support with my co-fellow parents, support of a foreign language at the school. And we're all going to share different perspectives as to why this is important to us. I want to share
Thank you.
So I'm Christine Chan. I have two kids, first graders, Hudson Lizzie and Dazzling. I'm going to be really quick because I actually am not an educator at all, and I have all the educational attributes of learning a foreign language individual documented at an early age. So really I have nothing to add to that argument. I'm speaking purely, I'm a business person, former entrepreneur, and benchmarking this, we're really not competitive with other districts when we look at this program. There are a lot of other districts that are offering language at an early age. And my question as a business person is like, why can't we do it? I'm oversimplifying this. I know there are a lot of cost considerations, but I think the public wants to know if they're looking at other districts. Very simply, what's the difference and why Irvington can't offer something that is clearly a competitive advantage for our children? That's very simple. That's all I ask. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to sit in and hear what we do. My name is Nina Shang. I'm the parent of a first grader at Dow's Lane, and as I got to get to know what was happening and what the group here, my friends are sharing with me, I found out my son who, we're a bilingual household. We spend nearly 3 hours a week learning Chinese language, and actually it's been very revealing. I've been able to see, first off, how capable he is to be able to do this, which makes me think, wow, other children can do the same thing too. But again, it's the time and the resources, and I thought about us in the future, practically, can we do this? Yeah, I think it's possible. He'll probably be okay in the end, but when I think about what that means for other children, that's what I think made me a bit sad as I thought about what opportunities I can give him versus other children who may not have the same access to the parents who are going to drive them to a specialized school, get additional tutoring, or have the resources to be able to get this kind of opportunity for their child. So in thinking broadly, that this is something that is very important, and I think echoing all the comments of our fellow parents here as well.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Ronna Horvath-Sparty. I'm a second grader. And just very briefly, we were talking about the new logo, and we moved here primarily because of the school district, and we also love the community. And when people see the logo, it should stand for really superiority, superior education. And we kind of expect that the Irvington schools would be at the forefront of superior education. And I think that it needs to be considered that we should offer the foreign language early or other opportunities to make local citizens that you referred to. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much.
Good evening. My name is Yasina Sorel. I have a fourth grader and first grader. I would like to say that the early foreign language instruction is closely related to the goals in the strategic plan, which we are trying to follow. And specifically, it relates to the following. Our students will need to be local citizens in a world that is growing ever smaller and more complex. Our students will therefore need to be flexible thinkers, problem solvers, effective communicators, and empathetic citizens. This is exactly what early foreign language instruction can provide. Learning a second language endows young children with cultural sensitivity and a better understanding of people from other parts of the world, fostering an ability to appreciate different perspectives. It is proven that learning a second language expands brain function and increases cognitive development and abilities such as memory, problem solving, analytical skills, and critical thinking. And this goes back to the strategic plan. This is exactly what we want from children. So whatever we know from all these researches, which is studies, we have to really use it. Numerous studies have also shown that children are most receptive to learning a second language from birth to 12 years of age. Children in Irvington start learning a second language exactly when the brain is already having a hard time understanding the concept of another language. Why do we have to make it so hard for them and not give them a chance to start when it comes naturally to them? Foreign languages should not compete with STEM education. They can integrate together and coexist in the curriculum. Other districts do successfully, and so could we.
Technology and the sciences are essential, but the world and the job market are asking more and more for those who can speak multiple languages fluently. They are looking for students who can adapt and understand others from different perspectives. We see great opportunity to add early for language instruction into a core curriculum to enhance the knowledge of a second language of the students in Irvington. I would like to point to the community-based surveys in the future that you mentioned during the presentation earlier. I think it would be wonderful if this could be done also not just the way we did it, locally, grassroots style, but also, through administration in the district, because there is really a need for that. Also, I would recommend doing a survey asking the students how they find their language teachers and the curriculum itself, because we actually receive some feedback from students, and I think it would be good to ask the students themselves what they think could be improved, because they have a lot to say. So thank you for this opportunity, and please hear us out. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Dylan Lenz. I'm an old timer, so my kids are past the age. But just to give a little bit of history, this isn't, and I tried to explain to parents, this isn't a new issue. And my concern is, from what I've seen historically, is, and with all due respect, what I see is waiting you out until you age out. And okay, we'll humor you, we'll listen to you, we'll let you speak for exactly 3 minutes, but once you're going to age out, you're going to forget about it. As an old timer, I think that world language is important. I've watched it from Liliana Capelli to Stephanie to, so I've seen it over the years. And I hope these parents stick with it. There are old timers that also believe that world language is important, those that won't benefit from it. Also, part of what I want to say is you spoke about community engagement, and that is an essential part of our strategic plan. When and how? We're given 3 minutes to speak and then rushed off the mic, and other questions like email it. That's great that people are emailing you, but how is public involvement in a team? And how are you engaging the community? We talked about curriculum and data. Where is the data? Everybody talks about data. Where is it? Where can we see it? A lot of committees have been disbanded that had engagement from parents and board members and teachers that no longer exist. I understand that there's a committee of 21 teachers and school staff. Well, what representation of the board? Are there reports for it? Can a parent attend them? Where do we get more engagement? Buildings and grounds, where are the reports? Like, where is the community engagement? Enthusiastic learners, elevated thinkers, that sounds great, but where is the data? You talked about how knowledge, what were the 4 points? The knowledge, meaningful, and transfer. Well, you don't transfer without the knowledge. So that is first and foremost, and that can be measured. We do know, and I'm sorry to contradict you, but we do know what jobs will be in 10 years. 10 years ago, they're same now. The technology that we use today is built on mainframe from 50 years ago. So it's not like we're going to end up in 10 years in Jetson world. So we do know what the jobs are going to be today, and it does include the global world and having additional language. It's also very difficult when you put in going over the goals of 4 schools in one meeting to go over the goals. I feel like it was more of a sales pitch. You don't have the time to ask questions, and it's so encompassing that you can't even remember what you wanted to ask. So I would recommend just to have more than just a sales pitch, to maybe break it down a little bit more, get a little bit more community engagement. That's my recommendation.
Thank you very much. Hello. I can hear you. It's good. You're good. You're good.
It's being recorded.
Thank you. Thank you.
As we all know, change is
Thank you very much. Okay. Sure, that'd be great. Thank you. Anybody want to ask Dr. Harrison any questions related to athletics?
Could you give us a full half-hour discussion?
Only if the community wants to be engaged.
But thank you. I mean, you know, so to you and to anyone else, there is a board at irvingtonschools.org, so in terms of the documents, that's another way to send them to us.
Good.
Thank you. Ever you want to save on color printing costs. But thank you very much.
That works.
Figured out that she wants some bedtime routine.
Yeah, that bedtime was an hour or two.
So,
We did?
With regards to mental back proper, there were several points raised in her email.
Your laugh makes me happy. It is. I'm not joking.
yeah.
Okay.
That's a great question. We're going to close our meeting and then we can respond to that. So can I get a
So moved.
actually,
I want to tell Della we didn't.
we're going to spend about 30 seconds deciding if we actually want to have executive session. Do we want to have executive
No,
session? One,
no.
2, 3, 4,
Oh, we
5.
have to decide that
Nay.
beforehand.
Someone's wildly waving their head yes? No.
Oh, nobody is.
All right, we're going to table that topic. And can I get a motion to,
So moved.
Second.
all in favor?
Aye.
Well done. I move that we accept Ms. Lenz's